Close your eyes and imagine the last lingering embers of a vast, ancient fire. The year is sometime in the late 5th century, and a chill has settled across the rolling hills and quiet river valleys of what was once the Roman province of Gaul. This is not the clean, sharp cold of winter, but a deeper, more unsettling kind, the cold that comes with an ending. The great Roman roads, once bustling with soldiers and merchants, are now often empty, slowly succumbing to weeds and neglect. The grand villas, with their mosaics and baths that stand silent, their former glory fading into memory. In the distance, you might hear the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer, a sound more of necessity than of industry, a small echo in the quiet lands. A new world is trying to be born, but it is not yet certain what it will be. The old certainties, the powerful reach of Rome, have crumbled away, leaving a patchwork of smaller, often warring kingdoms in their wake. The air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, carries whispers not in Latin, but in the rougher, more guttural tongues of newcomers. In a small, drafty hall lit by the flickering light of a few torches, a young man sits on a crude wooden throne. His name is Clovis, and he is the chieftain of a group of Germanic peoples known as the Franks. He is not a Roman emperor, nor does he pretend to be. His power comes not from the Senate in Rome, but from the loyalty of the warriors who stand at his back, their shadows long and dancing on the stone walls. His decision, made in this very moment, will not just change the course of his life, but will set in motion the creation of a nation that will one day be called France. What happened in this quiet, uncertain darkness when a young chieftain decided to embrace a new faith? Did you know this was the night a new history began to be written in the West? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, if you are listening to this in the early morning or the quiet of the night, feel free to share your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories travel. The story we are beginning to tell is a long and winding one, a tale of slow, deliberate change, like a river carving a new path through a landscape. The history of medieval France doesn't start with a bang, but with a series of quiet, almost imperceptible shifts as one world gives way to another. The late Roman period in Gaul was a time of gradual decline. The Roman administration, once so efficient and all-encompassing, became more and more a distant echo. The military legions were recalled to defend the heart of the empire, leaving the frontier provinces to fend for themselves against a tide of migrating peoples from the north and east. These were not always vast, invading armies, but often smaller groups of peoples, the Visigoths, the Burgundians, and of course the Franks, looking for new lands and a place to settle down. The local Gallo-Roman aristocrats and bishops became the de facto leaders, holding what power they could in a fragmenting world. Among these new groups, the Franks were particularly persistent. They were a confederation of Germanic tribes, initially inhabiting the lands across the Rhine River. They were known for their fierce fighting style, their long, distinctive hair, and a surprisingly flexible approach to conquest and settlement. Unlike the Goths or Vandals, who often swept in and established their own separate kingdoms, The Franks had a more organic relationship with the existing Gallo-Roman population. They assimilated, they integrated, and they didn't completely obliterate the old ways. This slow blending of cultures, of Germanic warrior traditions, and Roman administrative structures is the essential clay from which France would one day be molded. It was a bit like mixing two different types of Play-Doh. You don't get one or the other, you get a brand new color entirely. This is where Clovis I, our young chieftain from the introduction, steps onto the stage. He came from the Merovingian dynasty, named for his legendary grandfather, Merovec. When Clovis inherited his father's title, he was a king, but in a very limited sense. He controlled only a small portion of what is now northern France and Belgium. The rest of Gaul was a patchwork quilt of other kingdoms: the Visigoths in the southwest, the Burgundians in the southeast, and a few lingering, isolated pockets of Roman authority. Clovis was ambitious and perhaps a little bit ruthless. Over the next few decades, he systematically set about expanding his dominion. A crucial moment came in 486 at the Battle of Soissons, where he defeated the last Roman official in Gaul, a man named Syagrius. This victory was a major turning point, a final, definitive end to any pretense of Roman rule in the region. But Clovis's most significant strategic move, and the one that truly sets him apart, wasn't a military conquest. It was a religious conversion. Remember, the Franks were still pagan. The majority of the Gallo-Roman population and the other Germanic kingdoms, like the Visigoths, were Christian, but often of a different variety, known as Arian Christianity, which held a different view of the Holy Trinity. Clovis's wife, a Burgundian princess named Clotilde, was a Catholic Christian and had been gently urging her husband toward her faith for years. The moment of truth, as the story goes, came at the Battle of Tolbiac against the Alemanni, another Germanic tribe. Clovis's army was on the verge of defeat when he looked up to the heavens and in a moment of desperation prayed to the Christian God for victory, promising to convert if his prayers were answered. His army rallied, they won the day, and Clovis, true to his word, was baptized on Christmas Day, perhaps in 496, by Saint Remigius, the Bishop of Reims. This single act of conversion had immense consequences. By choosing to become a Catholic, Clovis wasn't just changing his personal beliefs, he was aligning himself with the powerful, established Gallo-Roman aristocracy and the influential bishops who held the reins of local power. This made his rule far more legitimate in the eyes of the native population than that of his Arian rivals. It was a brilliant political move, a strategic masterstroke that allowed him to bridge the gap between conqueror and conquered. It's a bit like a new CEO coming in and immediately making friends with the most influential people in the company, a shortcut to success, really. The conversion of Clovis and his subsequent expansionist wars against the Arian Visigoths and Burgundians meant that by the time he died in 511, he had created the first Frankish kingdom that encompassed most of Gaul. He had laid the cornerstone of what would become a new nation, a new culture, and a new history, all built on the fading memories of Rome. He was the first king of what we can now tentatively call France. The land and the people would for a time bear the name of his people, Francia. After the death of Clovis in 511, the vast kingdom he had forged did not remain whole. Following the Frankish custom, which treated the kingdom not as a single state, but as a private estate, his lands were divided among his 4 sons. This practice of partible inheritance, as it's known, became a recurring and deeply problematic theme for the Merovingian dynasty. Each generation, the kingdom was carved up, leading to constant and often brutal sibling rivalries. The brothers would fight for control, and then their sons would do the same, plunging Francia into a cycle of civil war and unstable reigns. It's a bit like a family with a particularly messy will, only instead of lawyers, they used swords. This constant infighting weakened the royal authority considerably and created a power vacuum that local aristocrats were all too happy to fill. The Merovingian kings themselves, who ruled for the next 2 centuries, became progressively less effective. Their story is often told as one of decline, leading to their famous nickname, the Rois Fainéants, or the Do-Nothing Kings. Now, this isn't entirely fair. Some of them, especially in the early years, did try to govern. But as time wore on, they began to lose real power to their chief officials, the mayors of the palace. The mayor of the palace, or mayor domus, was initially just the head of the royal household, managing the king's lands and affairs. But as the kings retreated into a life of luxury and symbolic authority, the mayor stepped up to handle the day-to-day business of running the kingdom, from managing finances to leading armies. It was a classic case of the assistant taking over the whole operation while the boss was, shall we say, otherwise engaged. The image we have of these later Merovingian kings is often a rather sad one. They were said to be paraded around on ox carts for public appearances, their long, unkempt hair, a symbol of their sacred royal lineage, and their beards flowing, while the real power was exercised behind the scenes. They were revered as a kind of magical or sacred figurehead, but they had no real political muscle. One of the most prominent of these mayors of the palace was a man named Pepin of Herstal. He was an astute and powerful figure who, through military victories and clever alliances, managed to unite the 3 main Frankish sub-kingdoms, Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy, under his control, all while leaving the Do-Nothing king on the throne. So the Pepin of Herstal effectively ruled Francia from 687 until his death in 714, passing the mayoral position down to his own family, establishing a new, powerful dynasty that would soon overshadow the Merovingians completely. His succession, however, was not without its own drama. When Pepin of Herstal died, his son was too young to rule, leading to another period of chaos and infighting. It was in this moment of vulnerability that a new figure emerged, one who would not only reclaim his family's power, but would also change the course of European history. This man was Charles Martel, Pepin's illegitimate son. Charles was a natural leader and a brilliant military strategist. He fought his way to the position of mayor of the palace, defeating his rivals and consolidating his power with a swift and ruthless efficiency. The kings, of course, were still there, but they were little more than puppets on a string, their every move dictated by Charles Martel. The backdrop to all of this internal Frankish squabbling was a seismic shift happening further south. The Islamic Umayyad Caliphate, having swept across North Africa and conquered the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, was beginning to push north across the Pyrenees Mountains into what is now southern France. This new and powerful force was a major threat to the fragile stability of the Frankish lands. In the year 721, a large Umayyad army besieged the city of Toulouse, but they were defeated by a Christian force led by Duke Odo of Aquitaine. The Arab commander, Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Kolani, was killed, and the threat seemed to recede for a time. But this was not the end. The Umayyad governor of Al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, was determined to expand his domain. In 732, his army, a large force of cavalry and infantry, crossed the Pyrenees and began to move deep into Frankish territory, sacking cities and monasteries as they went. Duke Odo, who had been defeated in a previous skirmish, was no longer able to hold them back. He fled north, a desperate plea for help on his lips. And so, the stage was set for a confrontation that would define an era. The Duke of Aquitaine, in a frantic state, reached out to the one man in Francia with the power and the army to stop the invaders, Charles Martel. Charles, who had been fighting his own battles against the Saxons and other tribes in the north, gathered his forces. He was a master of logistics and a shrewd commander, and he understood the scale of the threat. The historian Edward Gibbon famously mused that if the Muslims had won this battle, perhaps the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford. While historians still argue whether the Umayyad force was a full-scale invasion or merely a large-scale raiding party, there is no denying the profound impact this moment would have. It was a pivotal point in the history of medieval Europe and a testament to the quiet, behind-the-scenes power that a mayor of the palace had come to wield. The year was 732, and the two armies were on a collision course. On one side was the Umayyad force, a swift and powerful army that had swept through Spain and were now carrying out raids deep into Frankish territory. On the other side was Charles Martel, the Hammer, so named for the crushing force he brought to battle. He had assembled a surprisingly diverse army, not just of his Frankish warriors, but also contingents from other Germanic tribes he had subdued. The two armies finally met somewhere between the cities of Poitiers and Tours in what is now central France. The exact location is lost to history, but the significance of the battle that followed is not. It was here, in a field surrounded by woods, that the two very different forces would clash. The Frankish army, under Charles's command, was a mix of infantry. Charles, a clever tactician, chose his ground carefully. He arrayed his men on a wooded slope, which gave them the high ground and forced the Umayyad cavalry to charge uphill. His infantry formed a tight, impenetrable shield wall, a solid mass of men standing shoulder to shoulder with their shields locked together. It was a defensive formation designed to absorb the shock of a cavalry charge, a strategy perfectly suited to his forces. The Umayyad army, in contrast, was built around its fearsome light cavalry, highly mobile and devastating in a charge. Their commander, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, likely underestimated the disciplined Frankish infantry, believing they would break and flee under the weight of his cavalry. The battle lasted for several days, mostly a series of skirmishes and feints, with each side sizing the other up. The main engagement, however, was a chaotic, bloody affair. The Umayyad horsemen charged the Frankish shield wall again and again, but the Frankish line held firm. The heavy Frankish infantry, with their large shields and long spears, were like an immovable fortress. They withstood the charges, absorbing the blows and holding their ground. The hammer had built his wall, and it would not fall. The Umayyad horsemen, unable to break the line, began to grow frustrated and disorganized. They were accustomed to fighting against more lightly armored, less disciplined foes, and this was something entirely new. Their attacks lacked the unified force needed to punch a hole in the Frankish defenses. The turning point came when a rumor, or perhaps a deliberate tactic, spread through the Umayyad ranks that the Franks were attacking their camp and looting the treasures they had gathered from their raids. Many of the cavalry, seeing a chance to save their plunder, broke off from the main battle and raced back to the camp. This sudden, uncoordinated retreat was disastrous. Charles Martel seized the opportunity, and his men pressed forward, driving the remaining Umayyad forces from the field. Ibn al-Rahman was killed during the battle, and with their commander gone and their ranks in disarray, the Umayyad army retreated south under the cover of darkness. The Franks had won a decisive victory. This Battle of Tours, or the Battle of Poitiers as it is also known, is often cited as one of the most important battles in European history. It's considered by many historians to be the moment when the Islamic expansion into Western Europe was finally halted. Had the Franks lost, the cultural and political landscape of Europe might have been irrevocably changed. The victory solidified Charles Martel's power and reputation, not just within Francia, but across the Christian world. He was hailed as a savior, a champion of the Christian faith. It was a massive PR win, to put it in modern terms. The do-nothing Merovingian kings were now even more obviously irrelevant. Charles was the de facto ruler of the kingdom, the one with the military might and the political clout to command loyalty. Charles Martel, despite his immense power, never officially took the title of king. He was content to be mayor of the palace, exercising all the authority without the formal crown and keeping a Merovingian puppet on the throne. It was a clever move that avoided a direct and potentially destabilizing power grab. He spent the rest of his life consolidating his control over the various Frankish domains, laying the groundwork for his son to take the next crucial step. This gradual shift in power from the Merovingian bloodline to the family of the mayors of the palace shows how political authority can move from symbolic legitimacy to actual, pragmatic control. It was a slow, subtle revolution, a quiet changing of the guard that would forever alter the course of Frankish history. By the time Charles Martel died in 741, his family, the Carolingians, was the undisputed power behind the throne, just one step away from taking the throne for themselves. His legacy was not just in a single battle, but in the foundations of a new dynasty. The stage was set for a monumental change, but the final act of the Merovingian dynasty needed one last push. After Charles Martel's death, the position of mayor of the palace was passed on to his two sons, Charlemagne and Pepin the Short. They were both powerful and ambitious men, but Charlemagne eventually decided to retire to a monastery, leaving the entire weight of the kingdom on Pepin's shoulders. This left Pepin the sole ruler of Francia in all but name, and he grew tired of the pretense. Why be the man who did all the work when a do-nothing king still held the title? This kind of job title ambiguity wouldn't fly in the modern world, and Pepin decided to clear things up. The last Merovingian king, a man named Childeric III, was a puppet king, but even a puppet can sometimes get in the way. Pepin the Short was not a man to do things in a small way. He knew that simply overthrowing the king would be seen as a violation of a sacred lineage, potentially alienating the powerful bishops and nobles who believed in the Merovingian bloodline's divine right to rule. So he sought a higher form of approval. In a brilliant strategic move, he appealed directly to the Pope in Rome, Pope Zachary, with a very pointed question. Who should be king? The one who holds the title but has no power, or the one who holds the power but has no title? It was a rhetorical question, of course, but the Pope's answer was crucial. Pope Zachary, who was dealing with his own political problems with the Lombards in Italy, saw an opportunity for a powerful new ally. He responded that it was better for the man who actually held the power to also hold the royal title, so that the kingdom would not be in a state of disorder. This papal blessing was the justification Pepin needed. Armed with the Pope's authority, he had the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, formally deposed. Childeric was sent to a monastery, his long, symbolic hair, the source of his royal mystique, was cut off, a final and very public end to his reign. In 751, Pepin the Short was anointed and crowned king of the Franks by the Frankish bishops. His coronation wasn't just a political act, it was a religious one. The anointing with holy oil gave him a sacred legitimacy that the Merovingians had once held, but with a new, powerful twist. Pepin's rule was not just a matter of inheritance or conquest. It was now sanctioned by God himself through his representative, the Pope. This established a precedent that would last for centuries: the close alliance between the French monarchy and the Catholic Church. Pepin's reign, though short, was incredibly significant. He was a masterful politician and a capable military leader. He continued his father Charles Martel's work of pushing back the Saracens from southern France, and also launched campaigns against the Lombards in Italy, fulfilling his part of the alliance with the papacy. His famous donation of Pepin in 756, where he gave the Pope a large swath of land in Italy, created the Papal States and forever linked the fate of the Carolingian dynasty with the papacy. When he died, he left a secure and prosperous kingdom to his two sons, Carloman and Charlemagne. Carloman's death just 3 years later, however, left Charlemagne, the older brother, as the sole ruler. And now we come to one of the most towering figures of the entire medieval period, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. He was a man of immense stature, both literally and figuratively, described as being tall and robust with a powerful presence. His reign, which began in 768, marked the beginning of a golden age for the Franks. Charlemagne was a man of boundless energy and ambition. He was a warrior, a conqueror, and a reformer, and he saw himself as a successor to the Roman emperors of old. Over a reign of more than 40 years, he launched more than 50 military campaigns, expanding the Frankish kingdom in every direction. He conquered the Lombards in Italy, bringing their kingdom under his control. He fought a long and brutal war against the pagan Saxons, eventually forcing their conversion to Christianity. He pushed into Spain, though with mixed results, and he subdued the Avars, a nomadic people from Central Asia, seizing their vast treasures. By the end of the 8th century, Charlemagne had created an empire that stretched across what is now France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, and northern Italy. His court at Aachen became a center of intellectual and cultural life, attracting scholars from all over Europe. He launched a period of cultural revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance, which saw a renewed interest in classical learning, art, and literature. He promoted the creation of new monasteries and schools, and he sponsored the development of a new, clear script called Carolingian minuscule, which made reading and writing easier. This was a crucial step in the preservation and dissemination of knowledge during a period that had been largely defined by decline and chaos. The idea that a powerful warrior king also had a deep interest in education and culture was not a common one, and it shows the breadth of his vision. He wasn't just building an empire with swords, he was building one with ideas. Charlemagne's immense power and influence reached a crescendo on Christmas Day in the year 800. He was in Rome, attending Mass at St. Peter's Basilica. As he knelt in prayer, Pope Leo III suddenly placed a crown on his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. This was a truly revolutionary moment. The title of Emperor had been dormant in the West since the fall of the Roman Empire in 476, and its resurrection marked a bold statement. It signaled that there was a new, legitimate successor to the Roman legacy, and that he was a Frankish king. Now, historians still argue whether Charlemagne was genuinely surprised by this coronation, or if it was a carefully orchestrated event. The story goes that he was displeased, claiming he would never have entered the church if he had known the Pope's intention. But whether he liked the ceremony or not, the title of Holy Roman Emperor elevated his status far beyond that of a mere king. It gave him a divine mandate to rule and to protect the Christian world, a role he took very seriously. This newly established empire, often called the Carolingian Empire, was a truly remarkable achievement. It was the first time since the Roman Empire that such a vast territory in Western Europe was united under a single ruler. But Charlemagne wasn't just a conqueror, he was a master administrator. To govern his sprawling lands, he created a system of regional governors called counts. These counts were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and raising armies in their territories. To ensure the counts didn't get too powerful or corrupt, Charlemagne sent out royal inspectors, known as missi dominici, or envoys of the Lord, to travel in pairs, one a layman and one a clergyman, to monitor the local administration. It was a clever system of checks and balances, a kind of medieval quality control for his kingdom. The Carolingian Renaissance, which we touched upon earlier, was perhaps Charlemagne's most lasting legacy. He believed that a strong Christian empire required an educated clergy and an literate administration. He saw the poor quality of Latin and the scarcity of books as a serious problem. So he encouraged the establishment of cathedral schools and monastic schools, making sure that monks and priests were properly educated. The most famous of these scholars was Alcuin of York, who became the head of the palace school at Aachen. Alcuin and his colleagues worked to correct and copy ancient texts, preserving countless works of classical literature and Christian theology that might have otherwise been lost. They developed the Carolingian minuscule script, which was much clearer than the older, more difficult scripts, making the copying of manuscripts faster and more accurate. This initiative laid the groundwork for the intellectual and cultural revival of the High Middle Ages. It's a bit like a medieval librarian and a visionary king teaming up to create the first big publishing house. The impact on literacy and knowledge across Europe was immense. Charlemagne's empire, however, was a personal creation. It was held together by his immense personality, his charisma, and his relentless military campaigns. He was the glue that bound it all together. He was a man who, despite his fame and power, was said to have a simple diet and a deep love of learning. He reportedly spoke Latin and understood Greek, though he never quite mastered the art of writing himself, keeping a slate under his pillow to practice at night. This image of the mighty warrior king, who was also a humble student, has captivated people for centuries. He was, in a sense, a living legend, but, like his Merovingian predecessors, Charlemagne's approach to succession was rooted in Frankish tradition. Though he had the title of emperor, he still planned to divide his empire among his sons. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, only one son, Louis the Pious, outlived him. When Charlemagne died in 814, Louis inherited the entire empire. Louis was a devout and well-meaning ruler, but he lacked his father's sheer force of will and military genius. The vast empire was a heavy burden, and he struggled to maintain its unity. His reign was plagued by revolts from his own sons, who, much like their Merovingian ancestors, coveted their own share of the inheritance. This constant internal strife weakened the empire from within, making it vulnerable to the new threats that were emerging on its borders. The great unified empire that Charlemagne had forged was not to last. The seeds of its dissolution were already sown in the Frankish traditions of inheritance and in the growing power of local aristocrats. The centralized authority that Charlemagne had so painstakingly built began to fray at the edges. The stage was being set for the next chapter of this long story, one of division and the birth of new, separate kingdoms from the ashes of a united empire. The sun was about to set on the Carolingian ideal, and a new, more fragmented dawn was on the horizon. The death of Louis the Pious in 840 plunged the vast Carolingian Empire into a devastating civil war. Louis had 3 surviving sons, Lothair I, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald. Each of them wanted a larger share of the inheritance, and their conflict tore the empire apart. Lothair, as the eldest, claimed the title of emperor and demanded authority over his brothers. Louis the German and Charles the Bald, however, formed an alliance against him. They met in Strasbourg in 842 and swore an oath of mutual support, a moment known to history as the Oaths of Strasbourg. It's a fascinating historical tidbit because the oaths were sworn in 2 different languages, an early form of German and an early form of French, so that each brother's army could understand them. It's a clear signal that a unified empire with a single language and culture was already becoming a thing of the past. The conflict eventually proved too costly for all 3 brothers. They realized that a lasting peace was only possible through a formal division of the empire. So in August of 843, they met in the city of Verdun to sign a treaty that would forever change the map of Europe. The Treaty of Verdun was one of the most significant moments in early medieval history. It officially and permanently divided Charlemagne's empire into three distinct kingdoms, each given to one of the brothers. Lothair I, the eldest, received the title of emperor and was given the long, narrow strip of land in the middle. This kingdom, known as Middle Francia, was a geographically and culturally diverse region that stretched from the North Sea down to Italy, including the imperial cities of Aachen and Rome. It was a difficult kingdom to govern, with no natural borders, and it would not survive as a single entity for long. Its central location, however, would make it a crucial battleground for centuries. Louis the German received the lands to the east of the Rhine River, a region that would become the core of the future German kingdom, and Charles the Bald, the youngest brother, was granted West Francia, the westernmost portion of the empire, which corresponds roughly to the territory of modern-day France. The Treaty of Verdun was more than just a political division. It was a cultural one as well. It solidified the distinct political and cultural identities that were already beginning to emerge in these different regions. West Francia, under Charles the Bald, would continue to develop its own unique language and traditions, evolving from the Gallo-Roman and Frankish blend that had begun centuries earlier. It was in this moment that the first nascent shape of France emerged from the great but unsustainable Carolingian Empire. The dream of a unified Roman revival, however glorious under Charlemagne, had proven too fragile to withstand the realities of medieval politics and inheritance laws. The empire wasn't broken by outside invaders, but by a family dispute. The reigns of the later Carolingian kings in West Francia were for the most part a story of decline. They lacked the military prowess and political authority of their great ancestor. The royal court was often in flux, and the kings struggled to assert their control over the powerful local nobles. The power of the counts, dukes, and marquises grew as the king's power waned. These local lords, who had been appointed by Charlemagne to govern regions, began to treat their positions as hereditary and their lands as their own personal property. This decentralization of power laid the groundwork for the feudal system that would define the rest of the medieval period. Adding to the internal political struggles was a new and terrifying threat from the outside, the Vikings. Beginning in the late 8th century and intensifying in the 9th, longships filled with Viking raiders began to appear on the coasts and rivers of West Francia. They were fast, fierce, and unpredictable. They would sail up the Seine, the Loire, and the Garonne rivers, sacking towns, monasteries, and even cities like Paris. They were not just pirates. They were expert navigators and brutal warriors. The Carolingian kings, with their centralized authority in decline, were often unable to mount an effective defense. The people were left to the mercy of these raiders, and they turned to the men who could protect them, the local lords. This external threat was a catalyst for a major shift in the balance of power. The kings were failing to provide security, so the people turned to the local counts and dukes who had their own private armies and castles. These local lords would build fortified castles and organize resistance, and in return for their protection, the peasantry and smaller landowners would swear oaths of fealty and service to them. This system of reciprocal obligations, where land was granted in exchange for military service and loyalty, is the very essence of feudalism. It was a pragmatic response to a dangerous world, a way of organizing society in the absence of a strong central government. A bit like a neighborhood watch program that suddenly decides to run the entire town. It was born out of necessity, a system of mutual benefit that also cemented the power of the landed aristocracy. The Carolingian dynasty in West Francia was in a state of rapid decline, a long, drawn-out fade rather than a dramatic fall. The constant Viking raids were the most visible symptom of this decay. The Frankish kings, for a variety of reasons, were often unable to provide an effective defense. Their armies were cumbersome and slow to mobilize, and the Vikings were masters of hit-and-run raids. They would sail up a river, plunder a wealthy abbey or town, and be gone before the royal army could even begin to assemble. This inability to protect their subjects eroded the king's authority and prestige. It made the king look weak and, perhaps more importantly, useless. The people needed protection, and when the central government couldn't provide it, they found it elsewhere. This is where the local nobility truly came into their own. They were men of action, men who could build a fortress, a wooden motte and bailey castle, and organize a local militia. They were on the ground, and they could respond to a threat quickly. As a result, the people began to look to these local lords, these counts and dukes, for security. In exchange for this protection, they would pledge their loyalty and military service. This was the fundamental building block of feudalism, a system that was not designed from the top down, but which grew organically from the bottom up in response to the chaos of the age. It was a pragmatic and decentralized solution to a very dangerous problem. The king may have been the theoretical head of the kingdom, but the real power lay in the hands of the local lords who controlled the land and the men who worked it. This shift in power can be seen clearly in the political landscape of the late 9th and 10th centuries. The Carolingian line was still on the throne, but its grip was tenuous. A particularly telling moment came during the siege of Paris in 885-886. A massive Viking army laid siege to the city, which was then a small but strategically important town. The king at the time, Charles the Fat, was an ineffective ruler. The defense of Paris fell to two local lords, Count Odo of Paris and Bishop Goslin. They led a heroic and spirited resistance, holding out against the Vikings for over a year. When Charles the Fat finally arrived with his army, he didn't fight. Instead, he paid the Vikings a hefty sum to leave Paris alone and go raid Burgundy, a region that was supposedly under his protection. This cowardly and ineffective act was the last straw. The Frankish nobles, fed up with his incompetence, deposed him in 888. The nobles, rather than turning to another member of the Carolingian family, chose Odo, the heroic defender of Paris, to be their king. While a Carolingian would later regain the throne, the precedent had been set. The kingship was no longer strictly a matter of bloodline. The crown could be given to a powerful and competent noble, a man who had proven his worth. This back and forth between the Carolingians and the family of Odo, who were known as the Robertian Dynasty, continued for the next century. It was a long, slow struggle for the soul of the kingdom, with the nobles playing kingmaker. The ultimate winner would be the one who could best secure the support of the powerful lords and the church. The final act of this political drama came in the year 987. The last Carolingian king, Louis XV, died without an heir. The powerful nobles, led by a man named Gerber of Aurillac, gathered to choose a new king. The choice was not a difficult one. The Carolingian line had proven itself to be a string of weak and ineffectual rulers. The most powerful man in the kingdom, the one with the most land and influence, was Hugh Capet, the great-nephew of Odo. He was the Count of Paris and the Duke of the Franks, a title that made him the leader of the Frankish nobility. He had also secured the backing of the church, which saw him as a stable and pious alternative to the failing Carolingians. And so, in a ceremony at Senlis in July of 987, Hugh Capet was elected and crowned King of the Franks. It was a quiet moment without the grand ceremony of Charlemagne's coronation. His kingdom, West Francia, was a fragmented collection of duchies and counties, and his direct power was limited to a small territory around Paris and Orléans, known as the Île-de-France. He was, in a sense, just one lord among many, and not even the most powerful one. But his election marked a new beginning. The Capetian dynasty, named after him, was born. It would rule France in one form or another for the next 8 centuries. The transition from the Carolingians to the Capetians was not a dramatic revolution, but a peaceful and pragmatic transfer of power. The nobility, in a final act of king-making, had chosen a new family to lead them, a family that would slowly and with great patience transform a fragmented feudal kingdom into the powerful nation of France. Historians still debate whether Hugh Capet's rise was a coup d'etat or a natural progression of power. Either way, his accession was the quiet moment that changed everything. Hugh Capet's kingdom in 987 was less of a unified nation and more of a loose confederation of semi-independent states. His title, King of the Franks, was largely honorary outside of his own personal lands, the Île-de-France, a small but strategically vital territory centered around Paris and Orléans. To the north, the Duke of Normandy held vast and powerful lands. To the south and west, the Counts of Anjou, Blois, and Champagne were formidable rivals, often richer and with larger armies than the king himself. The Dukes of Aquitaine and Burgundy ruled their own domains with little to no regard for the king's authority. The early Capetians, therefore, faced a monumental task to transform this patchwork of feudal territories into a cohesive and powerful kingdom. They had the crown, but they lacked the crown's power. The first few generations of Capetian kings were not brilliant military leaders or grand conquerors. Their reigns were marked by a quiet, methodical, and often diplomatic effort to simply survive and, whenever possible, extend their influence. Their strategy was one of patience and persistence. One of their most clever and enduring strategies was to ensure a peaceful succession. Hugh Capet, a pragmatic man, had his son Robert crowned as co-ruler almost immediately after his own coronation. This practice of having the heir crowned while the current king was still alive, known as primogeniture, ensured that there would be no squabbling among the nobles or a power vacuum when the king died. The Capetian line continued this tradition for over 150 years, ensuring a stable and unbroken succession from father to son. This simple act of succession planning, a bit like a well-structured will, gave them a tremendous advantage over the previous dynasties and allowed the Capetian family's authority to grow steadily over generations. The early Capetian kings also benefited from their close relationship with the church. They were seen as the legitimate, divinely sanctioned rulers of the realm, and the church provided a crucial source of legitimacy and administrative support. The king's court was often staffed by educated clergymen, and the bishops and abbots often sided with the king against unruly secular lords. The church also helped to promote the idea of the king as a special, anointed figure, a protector of the Christian faith and the people. The kings leveraged this moral authority to their advantage, often intervening in disputes among nobles as a protector of the peace. However, their greatest challenge was their own feudal vassals. The powerful dukes and counts, who technically owed the king fealty, often acted as independent rulers, minting their own coins, raising their own armies, and waging war on their neighbors. The king's direct control was limited to his own royal domain, the Île-de-France, which was itself full of unruly petty barons who would extort merchants and travelers. This meant that a Capetian king couldn't even travel safely across his own domain without the risk of being ambushed. The king's authority was, to put it mildly, a bit of a joke in some quarters. The Capetian kings realized that their first priority had to be to consolidate their power within their own domain. They had to be masters of their own house before they could even think of commanding the whole kingdom. This meant a long, slow process of subduing the unruly barons of the Île-de-France. They fought a series of small, localized wars, building castles, besieging rebellious forts, and confiscating the lands of those who defied them. It was a tedious and difficult task, but it was essential. This focus on building a strong, secure base of power within their own territory was a key part of the Capetian strategy. They understood that a king's power was not measured by the size of his kingdom on a map, but by the extent of his actual control. This period also saw the development of key administrative institutions. The Capetians began to use a small but increasingly professional group of officials to manage the royal finances and justice. They were slowly building the machinery of a modern state, one small brick at a time. The early Capetian reigns of Hugh Capet, Robert II, and Philip the Fierce may not have been filled with grand conquests, but they were laying the essential groundwork for the future. They were patient, they were persistent, and they were, most importantly, masters of survival in a very dangerous political landscape. Their success was not in a single brilliant victory, but in a long, quiet process of incremental change. They were the ultimate long-game players of the medieval world, setting the stage for their more famous descendants to truly build the Kingdom of France. The early Capetian kings, as we've noted, were far from the all-powerful rulers of later lore. Their sphere of direct influence was a small, often unruly island in a sea of more powerful and independent feudal lords. This was particularly true of the king's own domain, the Île-de-France, a region that was more like a collection of fortified strongholds than a unified royal territory. The roads were dangerous, controlled by petty barons who preyed on merchants and travelers. The king's authority ended quite literally at the walls of his own castles. It was a situation that a modern ruler would find utterly unacceptable, but for the early Capetians, it was the reality of their power, or lack thereof. This began to change with the reign of Louis VI, who came to the throne in 1108. He was nicknamed Louis the Fat, not because he was lazy, but because he was, to put it gently, a man of generous proportions. Despite his physical size, he was a man of immense energy and a relentless warrior. He understood that the first and most crucial step to strengthening the French monarchy was to subdue the rebellious barons within his own domain. He couldn't be a king to all of France if he couldn't even be a king to Paris. His reign was a long, hard, and often boring series of small-scale wars and sieges against these troublesome nobles. He spent nearly every year of his reign fighting against local lords like the infamous Thomas of Coucy, whose family castle was a constant source of trouble. Louis VI's campaigns were not about grand conquests, but about establishing a basic level of order and justice. He worked tirelessly to dismantle the castles of these private warlords, to secure the roads, and to protect the merchants and pilgrims who traveled through his lands. He did this by a combination of military force and strategic alliances with towns and the church. He would often side with the local population against an oppressive lord, presenting himself as a champion of justice. This was a clever bit of public relations, positioning the king as the protector of the common man and a source of stability in a chaotic world. It slowly but surely began to give the Capetian monarchy a moral authority that went beyond its limited military power. This focus on the home front paid off. By the end of his reign, Louis VI had largely secured the Ile-de-France, transforming it from a den of thieves into a relatively peaceful and prosperous royal domain. This provided a secure base of power from which his successors could launch their own, more ambitious projects. It was the crucial step that allowed the Capetian dynasty to survive and eventually thrive. He was also a canny diplomat. He managed to avoid a major conflict with the English king, Henry I, and he established a close relationship with the powerful Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, who became his chief advisor and later a key figure in the next king's reign. Speaking of the next king, Louis VI's son, Louis VII, inherited a more stable kingdom, but he was a very different man from his father. He was pious and well-intentioned, but he lacked his father's political shrewdness and military grit. His reign, which began in 1137, would be dominated by a series of missteps, most notably his disastrous marriage to one of the most remarkable women of the entire medieval period, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was no ordinary queen. She was the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, one of the most powerful and wealthy feudal lords in all of France. Her lands in southwestern France were vast, stretching from the Loire Valley down to the Pyrenees. They were also incredibly rich, filled with vineyards, merchants, and a vibrant court culture. When Louis VII married Eleanor, he was marrying her lands and all the power that came with them. It was a strategic masterstroke for the Capetian dynasty, a massive territorial expansion without a single battle. A simple wedding had doubled the size of the kingdom. It seemed too good to be true, and as it turned out, it was. The marriage was a catastrophe from the start. Louis was a deeply religious man, almost monkish in his habits, while Eleanor was spirited, worldly, and a patron of the arts and the chivalric courtly love tradition. They were, to put it mildly, a terrible match. The two were constantly at odds. The situation was made worse by Louis's decision to take Eleanor with him on the Second Crusade. The crusade was a miserable failure, and Eleanor's independent behavior and supposed relationship with her uncle, Raymond of Antioch, further strained the marriage. After 15 years of marriage and 2 daughters, but no sons, Louis XVII decided to annul the marriage in 1152 on the grounds of consanguinity. They were too closely related. This was, in retrospect, one of the most costly decisions in the history of medieval France. The annulment gave Eleanor her lands back. She was a free, single, and incredibly wealthy woman. Just 2 months later, she married the far more ambitious and energetic Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou and Normandy, and heir to the throne of England. When Henry became King Henry II of England in 1154, he brought with him not only the crown of England, but also all of his and Eleanor's vast French holdings. The combined territories of this Angevin empire were immense, a veritable colossus that stretched from the north of England down to the Pyrenees. Henry II, as King of England, was also the most powerful lord in France. He held more land in France than the King of France himself. Louis XVII had, in a single careless act, turned his most powerful vassal into his greatest rival, a rivalry that would define French and English history for centuries to come. It was the moment the French monarchy truly realized the immense challenge it faced. The marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II of England in 1152 created a geopolitical monstrosity from the perspective of the French king. Henry II now controlled a sprawling collection of territories known as the Angevin Empire, which included England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Eleanor's vast duchy of Aquitaine. The sheer size of this domain was a constant looming threat to the French crown. The King of France was, in a very real sense, surrounded by the lands of his most powerful vassal. Louis VII, a pious and well-meaning but often ineffective king, was unable to do much about this sudden shift in the balance of power. He was a master of losing land through bad luck and worse decisions, and the Capetian dynasty needed a new kind of ruler. That ruler came in the form of his son, Philip II Augustus, who took the throne in 1180. Philip was a very different kind of king from his father. He was not a chivalrous crusader, but a shrewd and calculating politician. His nickname, Augustus, came from the Roman Emperor Augustus, and it was well-deserved. Philip was a master of diplomacy, a patient schemer, and a brilliant military strategist. He understood that his primary goal had to be to dismantle the Angevin Empire and to make the King of France the most powerful man in France once again. He realized that direct confrontation would be too risky. The Angevin Empire was too rich and too powerful to be defeated in a single battle. Instead, Philip decided to play a long game, using a combination of political maneuvering, subtle warfare, and exploiting the weaknesses of his enemies. Philip's grand strategy was to sow discord among the Plantagenet family. He knew that the sons of Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and John were a quarrelsome bunch. Henry II himself was a difficult man, and his sons were often in revolt against him and each other. Philip was a master at playing them off against one another. He would secretly support one brother in a revolt against his father or another, providing money, men, and political support. It was a classic divide and conquer strategy, and it worked brilliantly. He essentially turned Henry II's own family into his own private wrecking ball. The opportunity for a major breakthrough came when Richard the Lionheart became King of England in 1189. Richard was a legendary warrior and a chivalrous knight, but he was also a bit of a political naïve. He and Philip went on the Third Crusade together, but their alliance was a fragile one, and Philip returned to France early, leaving Richard to continue the fight. Upon his return, Philip immediately began to plot against Richard's lands in France, even going so far as to support Richard's own brother, John, against him. When Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, the Angevin Empire passed to his younger brother, King John. John was, to put it mildly, a disastrous king. He was known for his incompetence, his cruelty, and his unpopularity. Philip saw his chance. The trigger for the final war came when John abducted and married a French noblewoman, Isabella of Angoulême, who was already engaged to another French nobleman. Her family appealed to Philip, who, as John's feudal overlord for his French lands, summoned him to the French court to answer for his actions. John, predictably, refused to attend. Philip, with the full backing of the French court and the law, declared all of John's French lands to be forfeit. It was a brilliant, legalistic pretext for war. The war that followed from 1202 to 1204 was a turning point. John, who was known as Soft-Sword by his own people, was no match for Philip. Philip's armies, with the support of many disgruntled local nobles, swiftly conquered Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. The English garrisons were either too weak or too demoralized to put up a strong fight. The great castles, like Chateau Gaillard, built by Richard the Lionheart, fell to Philip's armies. By 1204, John had lost almost all of his lands in northern France. The Angevin Empire was, for all intents and purposes, broken. Philip's conquest of these lands was a monumental moment. It was the first major territorial expansion of the French monarchy and the crucial step in making the King of France the most powerful lord in his own kingdom. The French monarchy was no longer just a small power centered in Paris. It was a major player on the European stage. The victory also had a profound impact on England. The loss of Normandy forced the English kings to focus on their island kingdom, a shift that would have a lasting impact on English identity and governance. For France, it solidified the monarchy's power and gave them a new sense of purpose. Philip II Augustus, with his patience and cunning, had succeeded where his predecessors had failed. He was the architect of a new, more powerful, and more centralized French kingdom. With the victory over King John of England, Philip II Augustus had not only broken the Angevin Empire, but had also massively expanded the royal domain. The acquisition of Normandy, Anjou, and other territories gave the French monarchy a level of power and wealth it had never before known. He was, for the first time in centuries, the undisputed master of his own kingdom. However, Philip's triumph had also created a new challenge: what to do about the south. The southern regions of France, particularly the powerful and culturally distinct county of Toulouse and its neighbors, had always maintained a large degree of independence from the French crown. They had their own language, their own laws, and a vibrant, sophisticated culture that was very different from the more austere north. This cultural and political divide was brought to a head by the spread of a religious movement known as Catharism. The Cathars, or Albigensians as they were also known, were a group of heretics who believed in a dualistic worldview, arguing that the material world was created by an evil god and the spiritual world by a good god. They rejected many of the fundamental teachings and rituals of the Catholic Church, including the sacraments and the authority of the Pope. To the Church, this was not just a theological dispute, it was a grave threat to its very foundation. The Cathars had a large and influential following, particularly among the nobility in southern France, and the Church was determined to stamp them out. Pope Innocent III, a powerful and ambitious pontiff, had been trying to deal with the Cathar issue for years, sending missionaries and legates to the south to convert them. His efforts were met with little success. The final straw came in 1208, when a papal legate, Peter of Castelnau, was murdered by an unknown assailant, a crime which the Pope blamed on the Count of Toulouse, Raymond VI. Pope Innocent III, furious and frustrated, declared a crusade against the Cathars. He called upon the knights of northern France to take up arms against the heretics and their protectors in the south. This wasn't a crusade to a far-off land, but an internal war within the Kingdom of France. The call was answered with a great deal of enthusiasm by the northern French nobility. The crusade offered them not only the chance to earn spiritual merit, but also a golden opportunity to seize the rich lands of the south. Leading the crusade was the ambitious and brutal Simon de Montfort, a zealous nobleman from the north. The war, known as the Albigensian Crusade, was a bloody and devastating affair. The Crusaders, with the blessing of the Church, sacked cities, slaughtered populations, and confiscated the lands of Cathar sympathizers and their protectors. The siege and sack of the city of Béziers in 1209 was a particularly horrific event, where thousands of men, women, and children were massacred regardless of their faith. When a crusader asked the papal legate how to tell the heretics from the Catholics, the legate famously replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." This phrase, whether apocryphal or not, perfectly captures the brutal and indiscriminate nature of the crusade. The war dragged on for 2 decades, a long, drawn-out conflict that slowly but surely broke the power of the southern nobility. Simon de Montfort was killed at the siege of Toulouse in 1218, but the crusade continued. It was not until the reign of Philip's son, Louis VIII, and later Philip's grandson, Louis IX, that the conflict was finally brought to an end. The Treaty of Paris in 1229 officially ended the war. The Count of Toulouse, Raymond VII, was forced to cede 2/3 of his territory to the French crown, and his daughter and heir, Joan, was married to one of the French king's brothers, an arrangement that ensured the rest of the lands would eventually fall to the monarchy. The Albigensian Crusade, though a dark and bloody chapter in French history, was a major turning point for the French monarchy. It brought the rich and powerful regions of southern France under direct royal control, eliminating a major source of political independence and a potential rival to the crown. It also gave the king a new and powerful tool, the ability to wage war with the full blessing of the church. The consolidation of royal power in both the north and the south of France made the kingdom a truly unified state for the first time. The quiet, persistent efforts of the early Capetians had now borne fruit in a very big and very violent way. The foundations of a strong, centralized France had been laid, and the stage was set for the next great Capetian king to take the throne. The Albigensian Crusade, however brutal, had served its purpose for the French monarchy. It had eliminated a major source of internal opposition and brought a vast, wealthy territory under the direct control of the crown. The French king was now a truly powerful figure in his own realm, a far cry from the first Capetians who had struggled to control their own royal domain. It was in this newly strengthened kingdom that Louis the Mellion came to the throne in 1226 at the tender age of 12. His mother, Blanche of Castile, a formidable and intelligent woman, served as regent and effectively ruled France until he came of age. She was a master politician who put down rebellions and secured her son's throne, ensuring that when Louis took the reins of power, he was already in a very strong position. Louis Napoleon, known to history as St. Louis, was a different kind of king. Unlike the calculating Philip II Augustus or the bumbling Louis VII, Louis Napoleon was renowned for his deep piety and his unwavering commitment to justice. He was a devout Christian who wore a simple hair shirt, attended 2 masses a day, and was known for his personal acts of charity, such as feeding the poor and washing the feet of lepers. He saw his role as king not just as a political position, but as a moral one, a sacred trust from God to rule his people justly. This reputation for piety gave him a unique moral authority, both within France and across Europe. Louis's commitment to justice was perhaps his most lasting legacy. He established a system of royal courts and traveling judges who would hear cases and enforce the law across the kingdom. He issued a series of legal reforms, including the abolition of judicial duels, which had previously been a common method of resolving disputes. He also banned private warfare between nobles within the royal domain, a major step toward a more peaceful and centralized kingdom. Louis was known for his personal involvement in the judicial process, often sitting under a great oak tree at Vincennes, where he would hear the petitions of his subjects directly. This image of the king as the ultimate source of justice and fairness was a powerful one, and it further solidified the monarchy's legitimacy and popular support. His piety, however, also led him to take up the cross. Louis was a fervent crusader, and he launched 2 major crusades during his reign. The 7th Crusade, which began in 1248, was directed at Egypt. It was a well-intentioned but ultimately disastrous military expedition. Louis's army was initially successful, capturing the port city of Damietta, but they were later defeated, and Louis himself was captured. He was eventually ransomed, but the crusade was a failure. He returned to France and spent the next few years strengthening his kingdom and his reputation for justice. But his crusading zeal had not waned. In 1270, Louis IX launched the 8th Crusade, this time directed at Tunis. He believed that the ruler of Tunis could be converted to Christianity and that this would provide a base for an attack on Egypt. But the crusade was doomed from the start. A plague swept through his army shortly after they landed in North Africa. Louis himself fell ill and died on August 25th, 1270, with the word Jerusalem on his lips. He was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church just 27 years after his death, a testament to his immense reputation for piety and righteousness. Louis IX's reign, though marked by his personal crusading failures, was a period of immense consolidation and progress for the French monarchy. He transformed the kingdom from a collection of feuding feudal states into a more unified and centralized realm. He built on the work of his predecessors, but he added a new layer of moral authority and legal reform. His reign is often seen as the golden age of the Capetian dynasty. He was the perfect example of a medieval king, a just ruler, a protector of the church, and a warrior who led his men into battle. But the quiet strength and stability he had built would soon be tested by new challenges, both from within his own family and from a changing political landscape. The direct Capetian line was about to face a crisis of succession, a crisis that would ignite a fire that would burn for over a century. The long and prosperous reign of Louis IX, St. Louis, had brought an unprecedented level of stability and prestige to the French monarchy. But even the best laid plans can go awry. The problem was not with the kings themselves, but with the lack of them. The Capetian dynasty, which had so brilliantly managed to ensure a direct succession from father to son for over 300 years, was about to face a crisis it had no clear way of solving. The direct male line of succession, the very thing that had been the foundation of their power, was about to run out. The issue began with the death of Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, in 1314. He was a powerful and often ruthless king who had managed to further centralize royal power and had famously arrested the Knights Templar to seize their wealth. Philip had 3 sons, Louis the Augustus, Philip V, and Charles VII, all of whom would become King of France in rapid succession. The problem was that none of them produced a male heir who lived long enough to inherit the throne. First came Louis VI, a weak and ineffectual king who reigned for only 2 years. When he died in 1316, his wife was pregnant. The question of succession was suddenly thrown into turmoil. The nobles of France debated whether the crown should pass to his daughter, Joan, or to his unborn child. When the child was born, it was a boy, John I, but he lived for only 5 days. The French nobility, fearing the chaos of a female succession and the potential for a foreign king through marriage, decided to pass the crown to Louis VI's brother, Philip V. This was a major break with tradition, a pragmatic but ultimately controversial decision. They formalized this decision by invoking the ancient Salic law, which had been a Frankish code of law that contained provisions about land inheritance. The law stated that no part of the Salic land can fall to women, and the French legal scholars conveniently interpreted this to mean that no woman could inherit the throne of France. It was a retroactive legal justification, a bit like changing the rules of the game after the ball has already been kicked. Philip V, a more capable ruler, reigned for 6 years, but also died without a surviving male heir. The crown passed to his brother, Charles IV, in 1322. Charles's reign was also short and he too died without a male heir in 1328. This was the end of the direct line of the Capetian dynasty. The miracle of the Capetian succession, as historians often call it, had finally run out of miracles. The question of who should be king was no longer a simple one. The two main contenders for the throne were Philip, Count of Valois, a cousin of the last three kings, and Edward III of England, who was Charles VII's nephew through his mother Isabella. The French nobility, having already established the precedent of the Salic law to exclude women from the throne, argued that Edward III could not inherit the crown through his mother. Philip of Valois, who was a male descendant through a collateral male line, was the clear choice under this interpretation of the law. He was crowned as Philip VI in 1328, beginning the new Valois dynasty. Edward III of England, however, was not one to be easily deterred. He believed he had a more legitimate claim to the French throne. While he initially accepted Philip's succession, tensions between the two kingdoms were already at a boiling point. There were long-standing disputes over the English lands in France, particularly the Duchy of Gascony, which was a valuable source of wine and other goods. The French king's support for the Scots, who were in a state of rebellion against England, also fueled the animosity. The final spark came when Philip II confiscated Gascony in 1337, prompting Edward III to formally claim the French throne and launch an invasion. This was the beginning of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that would rage on and off for over a century and define the course of both French and English history. The long period of Capetian stability was over, and a new, more brutal era of warfare had begun. The 100 Years' War, which began in 1337, was not a single continuous conflict, but a series of interconnected wars and truces that would stretch across multiple generations. It was a long, brutal, and often confusing affair, a struggle for the very soul of the French kingdom. The English king, Edward III, had a strong claim to the French throne, but his true motivation was more pragmatic: to protect his remaining lands in France, particularly the vital Duchy of Gascony, and to seize control of the wealthy Flemish wool trade, which was a key part of the French economy. The French king, Philip II, was fighting not just for his throne, but for the very independence of his kingdom. The first phase of the war, from 1337 to 1360, was a disaster for France. The French nobility, steeped in the chivalric traditions of the past, believed that their superior numbers and their heavy cavalry would be enough to win the day. They were in for a rude awakening. The English, under Edward III, had developed a new and highly effective military strategy that combined disciplined infantry with the devastating power of the longbow. The longbow was a technological game changer. It could fire a volley of arrows with incredible speed and power, raining down death on the French knights before they could even close the distance. The first major battle of the war, the Battle of Crécy in 1346, was a stunning victory for the English. A large French army, confident in its numbers, charged a well-positioned English force on a hillside. The French knights in their heavy armor were no match for the hail of English arrows. The French army was decimated, and thousands of nobles were killed. It was a humiliating and shocking defeat. The English followed up this victory by laying siege to the strategic port city of Calais, which they captured a year later. The city would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries, a painful thorn in the side of the French monarchy. The situation for France went from bad to worse. The war was also fought on the economic front. England, with its strong navy, was able to disrupt French trade, and the constant pillaging by English and Gascon soldiers, known as chevauchés, devastated the French countryside. This was not the chivalric warfare of the songs. It was a brutal and destructive form of economic warfare designed to break the French will to fight. The most catastrophic defeat for the French came at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. The French king, John II, a chivalrous but incompetent commander, was leading a large army to intercept a small English force under the command of Edward III's son, Edward the Black Prince. The French, in another display of overconfidence, attacked the English, who were once again positioned on a hill and protected by their archers. The result was a repeat of Crécy, only worse. The French army was annihilated, and in a moment of sheer political and military humiliation, King John II was captured and taken as a prisoner to England. The capture of a king was a devastating blow to French morale and prestige. It was a moment of profound national crisis. With their king a prisoner, France descended into chaos. The Dauphin, the future Charles VII, was left to pick up the pieces of a kingdom that was on the verge of collapse. The country was plagued by internal revolts, most notably the Jacquerie, a violent peasant uprising in 1358, and the betrayal of the King of Navarre, who had a claim to the throne himself and was stirring up trouble. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 officially ended this phase of the war, but it was a terrible peace for France. The treaty gave England a vast amount of territory in France, including Aquitaine, in exchange for King John's release. The cost of his ransom was immense, and it further bled the country dry. The first phase of the 100 Years' War had been a series of crushing defeats for France. The new Valois dynasty had proven to be ineffective on the battlefield, and the English had demonstrated a tactical superiority that the French were unable to counter. France was a kingdom in disarray, its king a prisoner, its land ravaged, and its nobility disgraced. The very survival of the French monarchy was in question, but this was only the first chapter of a very long story, and the French would soon find a new leader who would begin to turn the tide. The capture of King John II at the Battle of Poitiers left France in a state of deep crisis. The kingdom was financially exhausted, politically fragmented, and humiliated on the international stage. Into this void of leadership stepped the Dauphin, Charles V, who had been ruling as regent since his father's capture. Charles was a very different kind of ruler from his father and grandfather. He was not a warrior king, but an intellectual, a student of politics, and a master strategist. He understood that the old ways of chivalry and direct confrontation were no longer effective against the English. He was a quiet, bookish man who preferred the council chamber to the battlefield, a bit of a nerd who was about to prove that brains could beat brawn. His first task was to restore order to a kingdom on the verge of collapse. The country was plagued by peasant uprisings, the Jacquerie, and the constant threat of roving mercenaries, known as the routiers, who plundered the countryside. Charles systematically put down these internal threats, using a combination of force and diplomacy. He also began the slow and painful process of rebuilding the French economy and administrative system. He reformed the tax system to raise the funds needed for a new army and a new kind of war. His vision was not to defeat the English in a single, decisive battle, but to win a war of attrition, slowly bleeding them dry and reclaiming French territory piece by piece. To achieve this, Charles V needed a new kind of military commander, and he found him in the form of a brilliant and ruthless Breton knight named Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin was a man of humble origins, known for his ugliness and his strategic genius. He was the antithesis of the chivalric French knights who had been so easily defeated by the English. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and sieges. His strategy was simple and effective. Avoid pitched battles at all costs, harass English supply lines, and slowly recapture territory by besieging English-held castles and towns. His motto was, "The more you fight, the more you win." It was a patient, methodical, and very unchivalrous approach to warfare, but it was exactly what France needed. The war began anew in 1369. Du Guesclin, who was made Constable of France by Charles, embarked on a series of campaigns that slowly but surely began to turn the tide. The French strategy of avoiding a major battle was maddeningly effective. The English, led by the ailing Black Prince, marched through France in a series of punishing chevauchées, but they couldn't force the French army to fight. The French would simply wait, hidden in their castles, until the English army had passed. Then they would emerge and retake the territory the English had just left. It was a bit like a game of whack-a-mole, only the English were constantly on the move and getting exhausted. Du Guesclin also took advantage of the internal divisions within the English-held territories. He would often bribe or negotiate with English garrisons to surrender, and he was master at using the local population to his advantage. The French peasantry, who had suffered terribly under the English raids, were more than willing to provide intelligence and support to the French army. By the end of Charles V's reign, the English had been pushed back to a few coastal enclaves, most notably the Duchy of Aquitaine. The vast lands they had won at the Treaty of Bretigny were almost all back in French hands. Charles V, the Wise, had managed to reverse the fortunes of France without ever winning a major battle. He had achieved what his father and grandfather could not, and he had done it with cunning and patience rather than brute force. The reign of Charles V was a period of true revival for the French monarchy. He not only won back lost territory, but also strengthened the royal administration, encouraged trade and the arts, and built new fortifications. He was a visionary king who understood that true power came not from a single, glorious victory, but from the slow and steady accumulation of resources and political capital. He was the right king for the right time, a man whose quiet wisdom saved his kingdom from the brink of extinction. But his death in 1380 and the ascension of his young and soon-to-be mentally ill son would plunge France into another round of chaos and civil war. The stability he had so carefully built would prove to be tragically short-lived. The quiet intellectual reign of Charles V had saved France from the brink, but his death in 1380, at the relatively young age of 42, plunged the kingdom into a new and dangerous era. His successor, Charles VI, was a boy of only 11 years old. This immediately led to a period of regency, where the country was ruled by his powerful and ambitious uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, and Burgundy. These men were more interested in enriching themselves and their own domains than in the well-being of the kingdom. The stability and order that Charles V had so carefully built began to crumble under the weight of their squabbling and greed. The situation was made infinitely worse by the onset of Charles VI's mental illness. In 1392, while on campaign, the young king suffered his first major psychotic episode, attacking his own knights and killing several of them. He had to be restrained and was later found to have lost all memory of the event. This was the beginning of a long and tragic period of madness. The king's episodes were unpredictable and terrifying. Sometimes he would believe he was made of glass and would refuse to let anyone touch him. Other times, he would run wildly through the halls of his palace. Because of this, he became known as Charles the Mad. The French government thus was plunged into a state of paralysis, as the king was often too incapacitated to rule, and his uncles and his younger brother, Louis of Orleans, vied for control of the regency. The political vacuum created by the king's madness, combined with the ambitions of the royal family, led to a new and devastating internal conflict, the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. The two main factions were led by the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, and the Duke of Orleans, Louis. The Burgundians, with their vast territories and their wealth from the cloth trade with England, were a formidable power in the northeast. The Armagnacs, named after the Count of Armagnac, who became the head of the faction after Louis of Orleans' assassination, were a powerful coalition of nobles who supported the royal family. The conflict was not just a squabble over power, it was a bloody and ruthless civil war that tore the country apart. Cities were sacked, nobles were assassinated, and the French countryside, which had been slowly recovering from the 100 Years' War, was once again ravaged. It was a tragedy on every level, and it was a direct result of the weak and divided central government. The conflict reached a new level of horror with the assassination of the Duke of Orleans in 1407, an act that was almost certainly ordered by John the Fearless. This plunged the country into open warfare between the two factions. The Burgundians, who were allied with the English crown, were essentially fighting their own king and their own countrymen. It was a betrayal of the highest order, and it exposed the deep-seated divisions that had been festering beneath the surface of the French monarchy. This internal conflict, this civil war, was the single greatest gift that the French could have given to their old enemy, the English. Adding to this internal chaos was the broader political and religious turmoil of the Western Schism. For over 30 years, the Catholic Church had been split between two rival popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon in southern France. This division not only undermined the spiritual authority of the Church, but also created a political fault line that further complicated the French internal conflicts. The Avignon Pope was supported by France, while the Roman Pope was supported by England and the Holy Roman Empire. The schism was a major political and diplomatic problem that added another layer of instability to the already chaotic French kingdom. Historians still debate whether the political divisions in France were a cause or a consequence of the broader schism, but there is no doubt that the two were deeply intertwined. In a rare moment of lucidity, the French king, Charles VI, and his court would try to broker a peace between the two warring factions. But these truces were always short-lived, and the fighting would soon resume. The country was a shambles, its government a joke, its king mad, and its nobles locked in a deadly civil war. This was the state of France when a new and ambitious English king, Henry XXXV, came to the throne and saw an opportunity that was simply too good to pass up. He would once again press the English claim to the French throne, and he would do it against a kingdom that was far too busy fighting itself to mount an effective defense. The stage was set for the next and most devastating chapter of the 100 Years' War. The disarray of France was a call to arms for the new English king, Henry V. He was a young and ambitious ruler, a brilliant military commander with a deep personal commitment to war and a strong sense of his own destiny. He saw the French kingdom torn apart by civil war and ruled by a mad king as a ripe plum ready for the picking. He was not interested in a slow war of attrition or a few extra territories. He wanted the French crown itself. He renewed the English claim to the throne, a claim that had been dormant for decades, and he began to prepare for a full-scale invasion. In 1415, Henry VI launched his campaign. He landed his army in Normandy, laid siege to the city of Harfleur, and captured it. But his army, weakened by a long siege and an outbreak of disease, was in no shape to continue campaigning. Instead of retreating by sea, Henry decided to march his army across northern France to the English-held port of Calais. It was a bold, risky, and almost suicidal move. The French, despite their internal divisions, managed to assemble a massive army to intercept him. The two forces met near the village of Agincourt on October 25th, 1415. The battle that followed was a repeat of history, only with an even more devastating outcome for the French. The French army, far outnumbering the English, was confident in its victory, but they made a series of critical tactical errors. The battle took place in a narrow field, hemmed in by woods, which neutralized the French numerical advantage. The ground was also wet and muddy from recent rains, making it incredibly difficult for the heavily armored French knights to maneuver or to charge. The English, on the other hand, were in a strong defensive position. Henry V had his famous longbowmen set up on the flanks, their wooden stakes pounded into the ground to provide a barrier against cavalry charges. It was a classic example of an English tactical setup, and the French walked right into it. The battle began with the French charging forward, a disorderly mass of knights and men-at-arms. They were met with a storm of English longbow arrows, a barrage so thick that it was said to blot out the sun. The French knights were mowed down by the thousands before they even reached the English lines. Those who did make it were exhausted and bogged down in the mud, unable to fight effectively. The English, with their lighter armor and a fighting style better suited to the conditions, were able to defeat the French with a devastating efficiency. It was a slaughter. The French losses were staggering, including many of the highest-ranking nobles and military leaders of the kingdom. The English, by contrast, suffered very few casualties. Agincourt was a humiliating and total catastrophe for the French nobility, and it broke the back of the French army for years to come. After the battle, Henry V continued his campaign of conquest, but he did so with an even more powerful tool, diplomacy. He exploited the ongoing civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, making an alliance with the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good. The Burgundians, still reeling from the murder of their leader, John the Fearless, at the hands of the Armagnacs, were more than willing to side with the English against the French Dauphin. This alliance was a political masterstroke, as it essentially gave Henry V a free hand to conquer France. In 1420, with the French king Charles VI still incapacitated by his madness, the French queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, and the Burgundians signed the Treaty of Troyes. The treaty was a complete capitulation. It disinherited the Dauphin, Charles, from the French throne, and named Henry V of England as the heir to the French crown. It also stipulated that Henry would marry Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois, uniting the two royal houses. Henry V was recognized as regent of France and heir apparent, and he was to assume the throne upon Charles VI's death. The treaty effectively handed the Kingdom of France over to the English. It was a moment of profound betrayal and a national humiliation for the French. It seemed that the 100 Years' War was over and that the English had won. France was a broken, occupied nation, its government in exile, and its future tied to the English crown. But the story of medieval France was not yet over. There was a young prince in the south, the disinherited Dauphin, who was not yet ready to give up. And there was a young peasant girl who would soon appear and change the course of history. The Treaty of Troyes and the great English victories had left France in a state of profound despair. The legitimate heir to the throne, the Dauphin Charles, was a disinherited, humiliated figure, mocked by his enemies as the King of Bourges because his authority was limited to a small area of central and southern France. The English, in alliance with the powerful Duke of Burgundy, controlled Paris and the entire northern half of the kingdom. It seemed that the centuries-long struggle for a unified French kingdom was over, and the English had won. The Dauphin was weak, indecisive, and his resources were minimal. He was the perfect example of a prince with a legitimate claim, but no real power. But destiny, as it so often does in these long stories, had a surprise in store. In the small village of Domremy, in a region still loyal to the French crown, a peasant girl was growing up. Her name was Joan of Arc. She was a deeply pious and illiterate girl who, at the age of 13, began to hear what she described as divine voices, the voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. These voices, she claimed, instructed her to go to the Dauphin, raise the siege of Orléans, and have him crowned King of France at Reims, the traditional coronation city. It was a mission that to any sane person would have sounded like the ravings of a madwoman. In 1429, at the age of 17, Joan of Arc convinced a local commander to take her to the Dauphin's court at Chinon. It was a long and dangerous journey through enemy territory. When she arrived, she was met with a great deal of skepticism. The Dauphin, Charles, and his court were a cynical bunch, and they had no reason to believe the claims of a peasant girl. Legend has it that Charles, to test her, disguised himself among his courtiers, but Joan, unerringly, walked straight to him and greeted him as her king. This dramatic encounter, whether true or a later embellishment, was the moment that changed everything. Joan's conviction and her unwavering belief in her divine mission began to win over the skeptical court. She was subjected to a series of theological interrogations by a council of bishops. They found her to be a sincere and pious girl, not a heretic or a madwoman. The Dauphin, once desperate for any sign of divine favor, decided to take a chance on her. He gave her a suit of armor and a banner, and she was sent to join the army that was preparing to relieve the siege of Orleans. The city had been under English siege for over 6 months, and its fall seemed imminent. The mood of the French army was one of despair and defeat. When Joan arrived at Orleans, her presence had a galvanizing effect. She was not a military commander, but she was a powerful symbol of hope and divine providence. She inspired the soldiers, who had been demoralized for years, with a new sense of purpose and a belief that God was on their side. She was a master of morale, a human firelighter for a kingdom that had been drowning in the dark. The French army, filled with a new sense of confidence, launched a series of attacks on the English fortifications. Joan, holding her banner aloft, was always at the front of the fighting, and she was even wounded in the shoulder by an arrow. The English, on the other hand, began to believe that she was a witch, and their morale plummeted. After just 9 days, the siege was lifted, and the English were in retreat. The lifting of the siege of Orleans was a monumental turning point in the war. It was the first major French victory in decades, and it broke the English momentum. Joan, now hailed as the Maid of Orleans, then urged the Dauphin to make the long and dangerous journey through enemy territory to Reims to be crowned king. The journey itself was a kind of religious pilgrimage and a massive political statement. The French army, with Joan at its head, marched to Reims, recapturing towns along the way. In July of 1429, the Dauphin was crowned King of France as Charles VII in the Cathedral of Reims. The coronation was a deeply symbolic act. It legitimized his rule and gave him the divine sanction that he had lacked since the Treaty of Troy. It was the moment he went from being a disinherited prince to a divinely ordained king. Joan of Arc's mission was not yet over, but her time was running out. After the coronation, she urged Charles VII to march on Paris, but the king, ever cautious, was hesitant. She was captured by the Burgundians in 1430 and was later sold to the English. Her subsequent trial and martyrdom would become one of the most famous and tragic stories of the medieval period, but her work was already done. She had given France a king, a symbol of hope, and a belief that their kingdom could and would be saved. With the coronation of Charles VII at Reims, the French monarchy had regained a crucial measure of legitimacy, but the war was far from over. Joan of Arc, the very symbol of this newfound hope, was gone. She was captured in 1430, sold to the English, and burned at the stake as a heretic in 1431. Her death was meant to demoralize the French, but it had the opposite effect. She became a martyr, a powerful symbol of French national identity and resistance. The English had not just killed a peasant girl. They had created a saintly figure who would forever be a rallying cry for the French cause. Charles VII, once a hesitant and indecisive prince, began to mature into a more capable and determined king. He was no longer the king of Bourges, but a legitimate monarch who saw his destiny as the liberator of his kingdom. He surrounded himself with a new generation of shrewd and capable advisors, men like the merchant Jacques Coeur, who helped him to reorganize the royal finances and build a modern standing army. Charles understood that the old feudal levies, which had been so easily defeated at Crécy and Agincourt, were no longer a match for the English military machine. He needed a professional army, one that was well trained and well equipped with new technologies. One of the key innovations of this period was the widespread use of gunpowder weapons. The French began to develop and deploy cannon, which were slow and cumbersome, but devastatingly effective against the English-held castles. The English had built their castles to withstand a traditional siege, but they were no match for the new French artillery. It was a technological arms race, and the French were beginning to win. The new French army, the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, was a far cry from the disorganized rabble that had been so easily defeated in the past. It was a disciplined force of cavalry and infantry, backed by the latest in siege technology. Charles VII also proved to be a masterful diplomat. His most important victory was a political one, the Treaty of Arras in 1435. This treaty was a peace agreement between the French crown and the powerful Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good. The Burgundians, who had been allied with the English since the murder of their duke, were now convinced to switch their allegiance back to the French. This was a monumental turning point in the war. The alliance with Burgundy had been the linchpin of the English strategy. Without it, the English position in France became untenable. The Burgundians formally recognized Charles VII as the rightful king of France and ended their war with him. The treaty not only isolated the English, but also brought a vast and wealthy territory back into the French sphere of influence. The final years of the war, from 1435 to 1453, were a slow, methodical French reconquest. Charles VII's new army, led by capable generals, began to systematically retake the English-held territories. The English, with their longbowmen and their traditional tactics, were no longer the unbeatable force they once were. They were outmatched by French cannons and outmaneuvered by French generals. One by one, the English garrisons fell. Paris was retaken in 1436, and the English were pushed back to a small strip of land in Normandy and Gascony. The final decisive battle of the 100 Years' War was the Battle of Castillon in 1453. The English, with their great general John Talbot, attempted to retake Gascony, which had been loyal to the English for centuries. But the French, led by Jean Bureau, had a well-fortified camp with a powerful artillery park. The English army, charging a fortified position, was once again decimated by French cannon fire. The battle was a complete rout, and John Talbot was killed. It was the last great battle of the war. After the defeat at Castillon, the English, exhausted and with a mad king of their own, Henry VI, were unable to mount another major campaign. They were pushed out of France, retaining only the port city of Calais. The 100 Years' War was over. The French had won. The once shattered kingdom was now stronger and more unified than it had ever been. The victory of Charles VII, known to history as Charles the Victorious or Charles the Well-Served, marked the end of the long period of English domination in France. It was a triumph of patience, strategy, and a new kind of warfare. The French monarchy, once on the verge of extinction, was now the dominant power in Western Europe. The French victory in the Hundred Years' War left the kingdom battered, but ultimately stronger. The war had forged a sense of national identity and had created a powerful, standing army that was loyal to the king, not to a feudal lord. But the monarchy's problems were not over. The very peace that had been won through so much bloodshed created new internal challenges. The greatest of these challenges came from the powerful Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, a man who was almost a king in his own right and who controlled a vast and wealthy territory that lay right on the eastern border of France. He was a formidable figure, a chivalrous knight who dreamed of creating his own kingdom, a new Middle Kingdom that would stand between France and the Holy Roman Empire. The new French king, Louis XIV, who came to the throne in 1461, was the perfect man to face this new threat. Louis was the opposite of the chivalrous and battle-hardened kings of the past. He was a shrewd, calculating, and deeply pragmatic ruler, a master of diplomacy and espionage. His contemporaries called him the Spider King because he wove a complex web of alliances and intrigues to achieve his goals. He was a man who preferred to win with words and bribes rather than with swords. He was, to put it simply, a brilliant politician in a world still dominated by warriors. Louis's main goal was to dismantle the power of the great feudal lords and to consolidate royal authority. He understood that the old feudal system, with its independent dukes and counts, was a threat to the centralized state he was trying to build. His great rival, Charles the Bold, was the embodiment of this old world, a man who saw himself as a peer of the king, not his vassal. The struggle between Louis XV and Charles the Bold, which lasted for over a decade, was a masterclass in political maneuvering. Charles was a man of action who loved a good battle and a glorious campaign. Louis was a man of patience who preferred to use spies, propaganda, and a carefully cultivated network of alliances to undermine his enemy. While Charles was off fighting wars against his neighbors and building his reputation as a great knight, Louis was quietly working to isolate him, turning his allies against him and waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a classic tortoise and the hare scenario, only the tortoise was a ruthless and cunning political genius. The turning point came when Charles the Bold, in his ambition to create a great kingdom, became embroiled in a series of conflicts with his neighbors, particularly the Swiss. The Swiss, with their highly disciplined infantry, were a new and formidable military force, a match for even the best knights. Louis, who had been secretly subsidizing the Swiss and other enemies of Charles, was able to watch from the sidelines as his rival bled his treasury and his army in a series of costly campaigns. Charles, in his hubris, was convinced that his chivalric prowess would be enough to defeat these upstarts. He was wrong. In 1477, Charles the Bold was killed at the Battle of Nancy, a battle he had lost to a coalition of his enemies, including the Swiss. His death was a moment of immense importance for the French monarchy. With Charles gone, his vast Burgundian territories, which had no direct male heir, were ripe for the taking. Louis XV, ever the opportunist, immediately seized the opportunity. He annexed a large portion of the Burgundian lands, including the Duchy of Burgundy itself. The rest, including the wealthy lands of the Netherlands, passed to Charles's daughter, Mary, who married the future Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, ensuring that the rivalry between France and the Habsburgs would continue for centuries. The annexation of Burgundy was the final and most crucial step in the consolidation of royal power in France. It eliminated the last great feudal rival to the French crown and gave the king a vast new territory and a huge source of wealth. Louis XIV had, through his cunning and patience, done what no other king had been able to do. He had broken the power of the great feudal lords and had created a truly centralized modern kingdom. When he died in 1483, he left his son, Charles VIII, a kingdom that was more unified, more prosperous, and more powerful than any of his predecessors had ever ruled. The long, slow process of building a powerful French monarchy was complete, and the stage was set for a new era of French expansionism. With the consolidation of the kingdom under Louis XV, France was now a unified and powerful nation, its internal squabbles with the great feudal lords largely a thing of the past. The stage was set for a new kind of French monarch, one who would look beyond the borders of his own kingdom for glory and expansion. The new king, Charles VIII, who came to the throne in 1483, was a young and ambitious ruler, but he was also a man who was deeply influenced by the romanticism of the past. He was a great admirer of the Italian Renaissance and the chivalric tales of knights and conquest. He saw himself not just as a king of France, but as a potential conqueror of Italy. His claim to the throne of the Kingdom of Naples, a claim that was a thin thread of a dynastic connection to the House of Anjou, was all the pretext he needed. In 1494, Charles VIII launched an invasion of Italy, a campaign that would begin a long and costly series of conflicts known as the Italian Wars. He led a large and well-equipped army, including the new French artillery, across the Alps. The Italian city-states, with their rich and sophisticated culture, but their fragmented political landscape, were no match for the French military machine. Charles's army marched through Italy with very little resistance, a kind of military parade through a country of art and learning. He entered Rome, then Florence, and finally reached Naples, where he was crowned king. It seemed, for a brief and glorious moment, that his dream of an Italian empire was coming true. But the French presence in Italy was a threat to the other great powers of Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Spain, and even the Pope himself were not willing to stand by and watch France become the dominant power in Italy. They formed a coalition, the League of Venice, to oppose the French. Charles VIII, a military genius but a political amateur, suddenly found his supply lines cut and his army isolated. He was forced to retreat, and his campaign in Italy, which had been so glorious at the start, ended in a scramble to get back to France. The French army fought a bloody but inconclusive battle against the League of Venice at Fornovo, but they were able to make it back to France, a retreat that was seen as a victory for the French, but was in reality a strategic failure. Charles VIII died in 1498, a tragic figure who had squandered his kingdom's wealth and prestige for a fleeting moment of glory. He was succeeded by his cousin, Louis XIV, a more pragmatic and cautious king. Louis the Fast, however, was also unable to resist the siren call of Italy. He had his own claim to the Duchy of Milan, and he too launched a series of campaigns in Italy. He was initially successful, conquering Milan and the surrounding territories, but like his predecessor, he was unable to hold on to his gains. The Italian wars had become a great power struggle, a kind of medieval world war, with all the major European powers fighting for control of the wealthy Italian peninsula. The wars were a long and costly affair for all involved. The Italian wars, though they were a military and financial drain on the French kingdom, had a profound cultural impact. The French nobility and the kings themselves were exposed to the art, literature, and learning of the Italian Renaissance. They brought back Italian artists, architects, and ideas, and this exposure helped to spark the French Renaissance. The French monarchy, once so focused on its internal problems, was now a major player on the European stage, but it was also a monarchy that was beginning to be influenced by the world beyond its borders. The focus had shifted from feudal consolidation to international prestige and a new kind of warfare. The old world of knights and castles was beginning to give way to a new world of diplomacy, artillery, and a global balance of power. The Italian wars, for all their bloodshed, were the crucible in which the modern French monarchy was forged. The Italian wars, for all their military and financial costs, had brought France into a new age. The focus on Italy and the rivalry with other European powers had forced the French monarchy to professionalize its army and its administration. The old, inward-looking feudal kingdom was now a major player on the European stage. This new, more confident France was personified by the king who came to the throne in 1515, a young and dynamic ruler named Francis de Lis. He was a Renaissance king, a man of immense personal charm, a great patron of the arts, and a formidable rival to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles I. Francis I's reign is often considered the high point of the French Renaissance. He was a man who embraced the new ideas and aesthetics that were coming from Italy. He invited Italian artists like Leonardo da Vinci to his court, commissioning him to paint and to design great projects. He was the king who built the magnificent Chateau de Chambord, a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture that blended French and Italian styles. Francis was not just a king of soldiers. He was a king of culture, a man who saw art and learning as an essential part of royal power and prestige. His court was a vibrant center of intellectual and artistic life, attracting scholars, poets, and musicians from all over Europe. But Francis I was also a warrior and a rival. His greatest opponent was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man who controlled a vast empire that included Spain, the Netherlands, and a large part of Italy and Germany. The rivalry between Francis and Charles was the defining conflict of the early 16th century. It was a struggle for dominance in Europe, a clash of two immense egos and two powerful kingdoms. This was a classic European power struggle, a kind of medieval game of chess with armies instead of knights. The two men fought a series of wars over control of Italy, but they also vied for influence in the Holy Roman Empire and for the loyalty of the Pope. The most famous of these conflicts was the Battle of Pavia in 1525, where Francis I was captured by the imperial army, a major and humiliating defeat. He was held captive in Spain for a year and was only released after signing a harsh treaty that forced him to give up many of his territories. He, of course, repudiated the treaty as soon as he was back in France, and the wars continued. The rivalry between France and the Habsburgs, as Charles V's dynasty was known, would continue for decades, long after both men were gone. It was a conflict that would shape the political map of Europe for centuries. The wars were fought across Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, and they were incredibly expensive. But they also had a lasting impact on French governance. To finance these wars, the French monarchy had to find new ways to raise money. They sold offices, they borrowed heavily, and they raised taxes, a process that further centralized the royal administration and gave the king more direct control over the kingdom's finances. It was a kind of a vicious cycle. The more they fought, the more they needed money. The more money they needed, the more power they had to seize from the local authorities. The reign of Francis I and the ongoing rivalry with the Habsburgs also had a more subtle and ultimately more dangerous impact on France. The rise of Protestantism, spurred by the Reformation in Germany, was beginning to spread into France. At first, Francis I, a man of a more tolerant and humanist bent, was not overly concerned. But as the Protestant movement, known as Huguenotism in France, began to gain a following among the nobility and the urban middle class, it became a political and religious threat. The affair of the placards in 1534, where Protestant posters were put up all over France, even on the door of the king's bedchamber, was a turning point. It convinced Francis that the Protestants were a threat to his authority and to the unity of his kingdom. He began a period of persecution, a decision that would lead to a religious conflict that would tear France apart for over 30 years. The age of grand Renaissance monarchs and great power rivalries was about to give way to a darker and more brutal era of internal religious warfare. The peaceful veneer of the French Renaissance began to crack under the pressure of religious dissent. The Protestant Reformation, which had taken hold in Germany, was gaining traction in France, particularly among the urban poor, a significant portion of the nobility and the ambitious middle class. The French Protestants, known as Huguenots, embraced the teachings of John Calvin, and their movement became a powerful political and military force in the kingdom. The Catholic monarchy, which saw itself as the defender of the one true faith and the embodiment of national unity, was deeply threatened by this new religious fervor. The persecution of Protestants that had begun under Francis I intensified under his successors, Henry II and his 3 sons, who would rule in rapid succession after his death. The death of Henry II in 1559 and the subsequent reigns of his 3 young and often incompetent sons plunged France into a period of political instability. The king's widow, Catherine de' Medici, a powerful and shrewd Italian princess, became the de facto ruler of France for decades, attempting to navigate the treacherous political landscape. She was caught between the 2 great aristocratic factions that vied for power: the Catholic Guise family, a powerful and fanatical group who championed the Catholic cause, and the Bourbon family, who were the leaders of the Huguenot faction, and by a twist of fate were next in line to the French throne. The stage was set for a long and brutal civil war, not just a religious conflict, but a dynastic struggle for the control of the French monarchy. The French Wars of Religion, which began in 1562, were a series of 8 conflicts that tore France apart for over 30 years. It was a vicious cycle of violence and revenge, with battles, assassinations, and massacres becoming a part of the national landscape. The civil wars were fought across the entire kingdom, from the fortified towns of the Huguenots in the south to the streets of Paris. The conflicts were often intertwined with the broader European power struggle, with the Spanish monarchy, a staunchly Catholic power, supporting the Guises, and the English and German Protestant princes providing aid to the Huguenots. It was a proxy war, a kind of preview of the 30 Years' War, with France as the primary battleground. The worst single act of violence during this period was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. The massacre was a deliberate act of political violence, an attempt to decapitate the Huguenot leadership. The leaders of the Huguenots had gathered in Paris for the wedding of the Protestant king of Navarre, Henry, to the king's sister, Margaret of Valois. It was meant to be a moment of reconciliation, a symbol of hope for a lasting peace. But the fragile peace was shattered. On the night of August 23rd, on the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day, a conspiracy led by the Guise family and possibly sanctioned by the king and his mother was unleashed. The signal for the massacre was given, and the Catholic mobs of Paris, armed with weapons, began to hunt down and murder the unsuspecting Protestant leaders and their followers. The violence quickly spread from Paris to other cities and towns across France. The number of victims is still debated by historians, but it is estimated that thousands of Huguenots were murdered in Paris and tens of thousands across the country in the days that followed. The massacre was a turning point. It ended any hope of a peaceful resolution to the religious conflict and radicalized both sides. The Huguenots, who had been a political and religious minority, were now a deeply distrustful and vengeful group, convinced that the Catholic monarchy was bent on their extermination. The wars of religion became even more brutal and unforgiving. Catherine de' Medici's attempts to find a middle ground and to maintain the power of the French crown had failed. Her policy of a fragile balance of power, of playing one side off against the other, had led to a national catastrophe. The massacre, a stain on the history of the French monarchy, had plunged the kingdom into a state of total war. The religious civil wars, which had been simmering for over a decade, were now a full-blown national crisis. It was a period of intense suffering and destruction, a time when the very idea of a unified French kingdom seemed like a distant and impossible dream. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was a turning point in the French Wars of Religion. It shattered any remaining trust between the Catholic and Huguenot factions and convinced many Protestants that they could not coexist with a Catholic monarchy. The wars that followed were even more vicious and brutal, a three-way struggle between the fanatical Catholic League, the Protestant Huguenots, and the Royalist faction led by the king, who tried to maintain a fragile balance of power. The country was in a state of anarchy, and the French monarchy was on the verge of total collapse. The conflict, known as the War of the Three Henries, was the final and most deadly chapter of the French Wars of Religion. The three main protagonists were King Henry III, a weak and indecisive king who was caught in the middle; Henry of Guise, the charismatic and popular leader of the Catholic League; and Henry of Navarre, the leader of the Huguenots and the legitimate heir to the throne. Henry of Guise was an immensely popular figure in Paris, where he was seen as the savior of the Catholic faith. He was more powerful than the king himself, and he openly defied royal authority. The situation came to a head in 1588 when the Catholic League, under the leadership of Henry of Guise, took control of Paris. The king, Henry III, was forced to flee the city. In a desperate act of political survival, he had Henry of Guise and his brother, the Cardinal of Guise, assassinated. This act of regicide, a violation of the sanctity of a noble, did not solve the king's problems. Instead, it turned the Catholic League into an even more powerful force, and it made Henry III a despised figure in the eyes of his own people. He was forced to turn to his old enemy, Henry of Navarre, for an alliance. The two Henrys joined forces to lay siege to Paris, which was now under the control of the Catholic League. But in 1589, a fanatical Catholic friar assassinated King Henry III. His dying words were to recognize Henry of Navarre as his successor. With the death of Henry III, Henry of Navarre was now, by law, the King of France. But he was a Protestant in a Catholic country, and he was faced with an immense challenge. The Catholic League, which controlled Paris and most of the major cities, refused to recognize him as king. They were backed by the Spanish monarchy, which sent armies and money to prevent a Protestant from taking the French throne. Henry of Navarre, a brilliant military commander and a shrewd politician, was faced with an almost impossible task: to conquer his own kingdom. The war that followed was a long and difficult one. Henry of Navarre won a series of battles, including the decisive Battle of Avery in 1590, but he was unable to take Paris, which was fiercely defended by the Catholic League. He famously said, "Paris is well worth a mass," a phrase that perfectly encapsulates his pragmatic approach to the problem. In 1593, he made the momentous decision to convert to Catholicism. It was a purely political move, a recognition that he could not rule a Catholic country as a Protestant. The conversion, though seen as an act of betrayal by some of his Huguenot followers, was a stroke of political genius. With his conversion, the Catholic League lost its reason for existing, and Paris, which had been under a long and brutal siege, finally opened its gates to its new king. The accession of Henry IV, as he was now known, marked the end of the French Wars of Religion and the beginning of a new dynasty, the Bourbon dynasty. Henry, a man who was widely seen as a savior, was faced with the monumental task of rebuilding a kingdom that had been torn apart by decades of civil war. His first act as king was to issue the Edict of Nantes in 1598, a landmark piece of legislation that granted the Huguenots a large degree of religious freedom and civil rights. It was not a full-fledged endorsement of religious tolerance, but it was a pragmatic solution that brought a fragile but lasting peace to the kingdom. Henry IV, with his pragmatism, his charm, and his unwavering commitment to his people, was a true hero king. He was the first modern French monarch, a man who understood that a king's power came not just from divine right, but from the love and loyalty of his people. He was the one who would finally bring an end to the long period of medieval chaos and set the stage for the powerful French monarchy of the early modern period. The assassination of Henry III and the subsequent conversion and accession of Henry IV brought an end to the brutal French wars of religion. The new king, a man of immense personal charm and political genius, was faced with the monumental task of rebuilding a kingdom that had been torn apart for over 30 years. His reign, from 1589 to 1610, was a period of healing, reconstruction, and a quiet but profound strengthening of the French monarchy. He understood that a king's power was not just in his army, but in the prosperity and loyalty of his people. Henry IV's first major act of reconciliation was the Edict of Nantes in 1598. This landmark piece of legislation was not a call for religious tolerance in the modern sense, but a pragmatic solution to a decades-long problem. It granted the Huguenots a large degree of religious freedom in certain parts of the kingdom, the right to hold public office, and the right to maintain their own fortified cities for their protection. The edict was a kind of truce, a way for Catholics and Protestants to coexist without killing each other. It was a bold and risky move, but it worked. The edict brought a fragile but lasting peace to France, and it was a crucial step in healing the religious divisions of the kingdom. It's the kind of thing you do when you're tired of the family arguing at the dinner table and you just want everyone to be quiet for a while. With the peace secured, Henry IV turned his attention to the rebuilding of his kingdom. He was a master of economic and administrative reform. He and his chief minister, the Duke of Sully, embarked on a series of projects to restore the French economy. They promoted agriculture, rebuilt roads and bridges, and drained swamps to create new farmland. Henry famously said that he wanted every peasant to have a chicken in his pot on Sunday, a phrase that perfectly captures his focus on the well-being of the common man. He also began the long process of rebuilding the royal administration, strengthening the king's power at the expense of the local nobility. He was a master of diplomacy and politics, and he used a combination of bribery, intimidation, and charm to bring the great nobles to heel. Henry IV was also a visionary monarch in his approach to urban planning. He oversaw a massive building program in Paris, including the construction of the magnificent Place des Vosges and the Pont Neuf, the oldest standing bridge across the Seine River. These projects not only beautified the capital, but also provided jobs and helped to restore a sense of national pride. He was a king who understood that symbols mattered, and he used architecture to project a sense of royal power and stability. He was, in a sense, a master of public relations, a king who knew how to make his people feel like they were a part of something great. The reign of Henry IV was also a period of renewed French international ambition. He saw the Habsburgs, who ruled Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, as the main threat to French power in Europe. He began to form a series of alliances to contain them, a policy that would be continued by his successors for over a century. He was a king who understood that a strong France was a key part of the European balance of power, and he was not afraid to use his diplomatic and military might to achieve his goals. Henry IV's reign, however, was not without its shadows. He was the subject of numerous assassination attempts and his conversion to Catholicism was never fully forgiven by the most fanatical Catholics. In 1610, he was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic named Francois Ravaillac. His death was a tragedy, but his legacy was secure. He had saved France from civil war, he had rebuilt the kingdom, and he had laid the groundwork for the powerful, centralized monarchy that would come to define the 17th century. He was the king who had united France, and his memory would be a powerful force for generations to come. The long, winding road of medieval French history was finally coming to a close, and a new, more modern, and more powerful nation was taking its place. The assassination of Henry IV in 1610 was a moment of profound sadness and political uncertainty for France. He had brought an end to the brutal wars of religion, and his pragmatic and wise rule had begun the long process of healing the kingdom. His death left his 9-year-old son, Louis XIV, on the throne, a position far too heavy for a child. This once again plunged France into a period of regency, with his mother, Marie de' Medici, at the helm. Marie was a well-intentioned, but often ineffective ruler, and her reign was marked by political intrigue and a renewed squabbling among the great nobles. The peace that Henry IV had so carefully built seemed to be on the verge of unraveling. The great nobles, who had been brought to heel by Henry the Valiant, saw the young king's minority as an opportunity to regain their lost power and independence. The country was once again on the brink of civil war, with various factions vying for control of the government. This was a classic moment of French political drama, where the king was a figurehead and the real power was in the hands of the ambitious and self-serving aristocrats. Louis XIII, however, was not one to be a puppet. He was a quiet, withdrawn, and often sickly man, but he was also a man with a steely resolve. In 1617, at the age of 16, he staged a kind of a coup, having his mother's favorite minister assassinated and taking control of the government himself. It was a decisive and ruthless act, a clear signal that he was not going to be another do-nothing king. But the real turning point of Louis XIII's reign, and one of the most important moments in French history, came in 1624 with the appointment of Cardinal Richelieu as his chief minister. Richelieu was a man of immense intelligence, a master politician, and a visionary statesman. He was a man who believed in the absolute authority of the king and the absolute power of the French state. His political vision was simple and unyielding: to make the king's power absolute at home and to make France the dominant power in Europe. He was a man who saw the state as a machine and himself as the engineer. Richelieu's domestic policy was brutal and effective. He was determined to break the power of the great nobles, who he saw as the main obstacle to a centralized state. He dismantled their castles, forbade them from waging private wars, and had those who defied him executed. He also cracked down on the Huguenots, who with their fortified cities and their independent political assemblies were a state within a state. He saw them not as a religious threat, but as a political one. He led a long and brutal siege of the Huguenot stronghold of La Rochelle, which fell in 1628. He allowed the Huguenots to keep their religious freedom, but he stripped them of their political and military power. This was a crucial step in the creation of a unified French state. On the international stage, Richelieu's policy was equally ruthless and effective. He was a man who put the interests of the French state above all else, including religious affiliation. He was a Catholic cardinal, but he was not afraid to ally with Protestant powers, like the Dutch and the German princes, to counter the power of the Catholic Habsburgs, who were still the main rivals of France. He plunged France into the 30 Years' War, a long and devastating conflict that was tearing Germany apart. France entered the war on the side of the Protestants, a shocking and pragmatic move that was designed to weaken the Habsburgs and to extend French influence in Europe. Richelieu's policies were incredibly successful. He had largely broken the power of the nobles, he had brought the Huguenots to heel, and he had made France a major player in Europe. He had laid the groundwork for the absolute monarchy that would reach its peak under Louis XIV. He was a ruthless and often feared man, but he was also a man who was devoted to the service of his king and his country. He died in 1642, just a year before his king, but his legacy was secure. He had transformed France from a weak and divided kingdom into a powerful and centralized state. His policies, however, had also set the stage for a new kind of royal power, one that would be even more absolute and centralized than he could have ever imagined. The death of Cardinal Richelieu in 1642, followed by the death of Louis XIV just a year later, brought another young king to the French throne. Louis XIV was just 5 years old when he became king. This once again triggered a period of regency with his mother, Anne of Austria, as regent and Cardinal Mazarin, Richelieu's protégé, as her chief minister. Mazarin was a brilliant politician who continued Richelieu's policies of centralizing the monarchy and countering the Habsburgs. But his foreign-born status and his unpopular tax policies led to a period of open rebellion known as the Fronde. It was the last great gasp of the old French nobility and the urban middle class to resist the growing power of the monarchy. The Fronde, which lasted from 1648 to 1653, was a complex series of revolts. It began with the Parlement of Paris, a high court protesting new royal taxes. The revolt soon spread, and it became a full-blown civil war, with various factions of nobles, disgruntled princes, and commoners all fighting against the royal government. The young Louis XIV and his mother were even forced to flee Paris at one point. The Fronde was a traumatic experience for the young king, and it would forever shape his political philosophy. He saw firsthand the chaos and instability that came from a divided kingdom and a weak monarchy. He vowed that when he came of age, he would never allow anyone to challenge his authority again. When Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661, Louis XIV, now 23, made a surprising and decisive move. He announced to his council that he would no longer have a chief minister. From now on, he would be his own chief minister, making all the decisions himself. This was the moment that the absolute monarchy in France truly began. Louis XIV famously said, "L'État, c'est moi," or "I am the state," a phrase that perfectly encapsulates his belief in his own divine right to rule. He saw himself as God's representative on earth, and he believed that his power was absolute and unquestionable. Louis XIV was a brilliant and tireless king. He worked for hours every day, overseeing every detail of the government, from the military to the arts. He created a new system of governance with a centralized bureaucracy that was loyal to him alone. He bypassed the traditional power structures of the nobility and instead appointed commoners and members of the lower aristocracy to key positions, knowing that their loyalty would be to him and not to their own feudal families. It was a clever way of ensuring that his orders were carried out without question. The most visible symbol of Louis XIV's absolute power was the Palace of Versailles. It was originally a small hunting lodge, but Louis transformed it into a magnificent, sprawling palace that was the center of his government and the heart of French court life. He forced the great nobles to live at Versailles, where they were kept busy with a complex and rigid system of court etiquette and ceremony. They were no longer a threat to his power because they were too busy competing for his attention and for social status. He had, in effect, turned the unruly, rebellious nobility into his own personal courtiers, a brilliant piece of social engineering. The reign of Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, was a period of immense military and cultural dominance for France. His armies, led by great generals, were the most powerful in Europe. He waged a series of wars to expand French territory and to contain the Habsburgs, and he was largely successful. His long reign was a golden age of French art, literature, and science. The works of Molière, Racine, and other great artists flourished under his patronage. The French language became the language of diplomacy and high culture across Europe. Louis XIV's reign, which lasted for 72 years, was the culmination of the centuries-long process of building a powerful French monarchy. He had taken the foundations laid by Philip II Augustus, Louis Napoleon, and Cardinal Richelieu, and had built a system of governance that was the envy of Europe. He was the perfect example of an absolute monarch, a man who saw no distinction between his own will and the will of the state. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but his rule brought a period of stability and glory that France had never before known. The long story of medieval and early modern France was reaching its conclusion, and its final act was one of absolute power and immense prestige. The reign of Louis XIV was a golden age of French power and prestige, but it was not without its shadows. The centralization of power and the constant warfare of his long reign came at a great cost. The French peasantry, who bore the brunt of the taxes, were often in a state of deep poverty, and the kingdom's finances were perpetually strained. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, a decision that Louis XIV made to achieve religious uniformity, was a major blow to the French economy and a moral stain on his reign. The edict had brought peace, but its revocation, which forced hundreds of thousands of Huguenots to either convert or flee the country, robbed France of a large and industrious portion of its population. The Huguenots, many of whom were skilled artisans, merchants, and soldiers, took their talents and their wealth with them to England, the Netherlands, and Germany, a kind of self-inflicted brain drain. The long and costly wars that Louis XIV fought also had a devastating impact. The War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted for over a decade, was a massive European conflict that pitted France against a coalition of other powers, including England, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Netherlands. The war was fought to prevent Louis XIV's grandson from inheriting the throne of Spain, a move that would have created a French-Spanish superstate and a major threat to the balance of power in Europe. The war was a stalemate, but it left France financially and militarily exhausted. By the time Louis XIV died in 1715, he had outlived his son and his grandson, and the kingdom was left to his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV. The long, glorious reign of the Sun King had come to a close, and a new period of regency and political instability was on the horizon. The death of Louis XIV marked the end of an era, but his legacy was secure. He had taken the Kingdom of France and had transformed it into a powerful, centralized state. He had broken the power of the great feudal lords, and he had created a system of government that was the envy of Europe. The long, slow process of building a powerful French monarchy, a process that had begun with the early Capetians, had reached its peak. The feudal chaos of the medieval period was a distant memory. France was now a unified nation, a major player on the European stage, but the seeds of its future problems were already sown. The absolute monarchy, which had been so effective under a brilliant and tireless king, was a system that was deeply flawed and profoundly unjust. This leads us to the very end of our long story. The story we have been telling of the rise of the French monarchy is a story of a journey from a fragmented, feudal kingdom to a powerful, centralized state. It is a story of great kings like Philip II Augustus and Louis XIX, who used cunning and piety to consolidate their power. It is a story of great failures, like the early 100 Years' War, and great victories, like the final expulsion of the English. It is a story of a country that was torn apart by civil war and religious conflict, but was ultimately saved by a series of pragmatic and wise rulers. The story of medieval France is a story of slow, incremental change, of a gradual process of building a nation from a patchwork of warring states. The France that existed at the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the early modern period was a very different country from the one we started with. The old feudal ties, where loyalty was a personal bond between a lord and his vassal, had been replaced by a more impersonal and more powerful state. The king was no longer just the first among equals. He was a divinely ordained ruler, a master of a vast and powerful kingdom. The country had a professional army, a centralized bureaucracy, and a capital city, Paris, that was the center of European culture. The medieval period, with its knights and castles and its decentralized political system, was over. The stage was set for the powerful, absolute monarchy of the early modern period, a monarchy that would eventually be brought down by its own hubris and its own injustices. The long journey from a small Frankish kingdom in Gaul to the powerful nation of France was complete. The reign of Louis XIV was not a period of unbridled success and glory. While his time on the throne is often viewed as the pinnacle of the French absolute monarchy, it was a grandeur built on a fragile foundation. The relentless pursuit of war, both for territorial expansion and to counter the Habsburgs, left the kingdom financially exhausted. The massive expenditures on the Palace of Versailles, a symbol of royal power, were a constant drain on the treasury. Taxes, levied almost exclusively on the common people and the peasantry, grew to astronomical levels, fostering resentment and widespread poverty. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, a move to enforce religious uniformity, was another critical error. It drove away skilled Huguenot artisans, merchants, and soldiers, a significant portion of the country's industrious population. This self-inflicted brain drain and economic setback were major blows to the kingdom's long-term prosperity. Louis XIV's long and costly wars, particularly the War of the Spanish Succession, did secure a Bourbon monarch on the Spanish throne, but the price was a near-bankrupt France. He outlived his son and his grandson, a succession crisis that left his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV, as his heir. The Sun King's death in 1715 marked not just the end of a reign, but the end of an era. The absolute monarchy he had so carefully constructed was left in the hands of a child, and the country was burdened with a mountain of debt, a disgruntled populace, and a nobility still chafing under the restrictions of Versailles. The problems of the medieval period, disunity, internal squabbling, and financial instability had been solved, but they had been replaced by a new set of problems inherent to an over-centralized and absolutist state. This leads us to the end of our long story and the start of a new one. The journey from the fragmented, feudal world of the 5th century to the centralized, absolute monarchy of the 18th century was a long and winding one. It began with the slow decline of Roman Gaul and the rise of the Frankish kingdom under Clovis I, a ruler who understood the importance of a strategic religious conversion. It continued with the do-nothing Merovingian kings, a period of political decay that gave rise to a new dynasty, the Carolingians, under the brilliant leadership of Charles Martel and Charlemagne. The empire of Charlemagne, however, was too personal and too vast to survive, and its division at the Treaty of Verdun gave birth to the nascent kingdom of West Francia, the early form of France. The early Capetian kings, though weak in direct power, were masters of survival and long-term strategy. They patiently consolidated their authority within their small royal domain, laying the groundwork for more ambitious and powerful successors like Philip II Augustus and Louis IX. The 100 Years' War, a long and brutal conflict that threatened the very existence of the French monarchy, was a crucible that forged a new sense of national identity and a powerful, standing army. The war, a disaster at first, was ultimately won through the unlikely heroism of Joan of Arc and the cunning leadership of Charles VII. The final step in the consolidation of royal power came with the ruthless diplomacy of Louis XV, who dismantled the last great feudal rival, Charles the Bold of Burgundy. The Italian wars, for all their cost, brought France into the wider world of the European Renaissance and the age of great power politics, culminating in the reign of Francis III. The French Wars of Religion, a brutal period of civil and religious conflict, nearly tore the kingdom apart, but was finally resolved by the pragmatic and wise rule of Henry IV, who founded the Bourbon Dynasty. The final act of this long story was the creation of the absolute monarchy under Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIV, a system of governance that was the culmination of all the previous centuries of struggle for a unified, powerful French state. The medieval period, with its knights and castles, had given way to the early modern period, with its standing armies, its palaces, and its absolute kings. The long, last slow journey from chaos to order was complete, and a new chapter in the story of France, with its own challenges and its own tragedies, was just beginning. The long, winding road of French medieval history, from the embers of Roman Gaul to the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV, was a journey defined by a slow, deliberate accumulation of power. The fragmented, decentralized kingdom of the early Capetians, a patchwork of independent lords and territories, had been painstakingly transformed into a unified, powerful state. The great internal struggles, the Viking raids, the feudal rivalries, the 100 Years' War, and the wars of religion had all, in their own way, contributed to this final outcome. Each crisis, each challenge, had been met with a new solution that inevitably strengthened the hand of the king. The power of the king, once a fragile and often contested thing, had become the absolute and unquestionable will of the state. But this grand story, this long journey toward a unified and powerful France, was now at its end. The medieval period was over. The great tapestry of kings, knights, and castles had been woven, and a new story was beginning. The France of the early 18th century, a country of immense power and prestige, was also a country of immense contradictions. It was a kingdom of grand palaces and profound poverty, of a powerful army and a crippling national debt. The very system that had brought France to such a position of power, the absolute monarchy, was also the source of its deepest flaws. The seeds of the French Revolution, of a new, more radical, and far more violent change, were already sown in the soil of the old regime. And so his story sank into legend, the long, quiet process of building a nation from the ashes of an empire. This was the final chapter of a story that began in the quiet of a late Roman afternoon, and it ended in the brilliant, but ultimately unsustainable, light of the Sun King's court. It was a journey of over 1,000 years, a slow and steady current that flowed from the chaotic fragmentation of the Dark Ages to the centralized power of the modern state. The old world of chivalry and feudalism had faded away, replaced by a new world of bureaucracy, of professional armies, and of a powerful central government. The names of the early kings, the Merovingians and the Carolingians, were little more than echoes, whispers on the wind. The names of the later kings, the great Capetians and the Bourbons, were now the very heart of the nation's identity. This journey has been a long one, and the long road of history, as we've seen, is never a straight line. It has its moments of quiet, its moments of immense drama, and its moments of great change. And now, this particular journey is at its end. The story is complete, and the stage is set for a new one. And so, we leave the long history of medieval France in the quiet of the night. You can let the names of the kings and the places and the battles fade now, like the last echoes of a story told around a fire. The long, winding journey has reached its destination, and the quiet of the night has finally settled over the rolling hills and the ancient cities of this long-storied land. Let your mind drift now. The long journey is over. The quiet of the night is here. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.